Wyoming, 1883. 100 acres of land sold for $1. No honest man does that. The deed was still warm in his pocket when he pushed open the door of a house that was supposed to be empty. It wasn't. Someone had kept the fire burning. Someone had patched the roof and cleaned the well and tended this place for 3 years like it was worth dying for, because it was footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate. Then a woman's voice, steady as stone. Don't reach for that gun. He didn't. Outside, 3 riders were already coming down the north trail, spread wide, moving like men who'd been paid to make sure nobody left. The woman's eyes didn't go to the window. She already knew they were coming. She'd been waiting for this day for a long time. She just hadn't expected him. 100 acres of Wyoming grass for $1. No honest man sells land like that. Not in 1883. Not in a territory where neighbors trade gunfire over the question of where one fence ends and the next begins. So when a price like that gets written on a deed, it means one of 2 things. Either the ground is poisoned, or the man behind the desk is running from something he hasn't got the nerve to say aloud. Garrett Dalton would learn it was the second. He would learn that the dollar bought him a roof, and under the roof a woman the whole world had thrown away, and under the woman's feet a fortune that 3 good men had already died to keep buried. He would learn that some bargains aren't bargains at all. They're a hand reaching up out of the dark, asking you to be the one who finally reaches back. But on the morning it began, he knew none of that. He knew only that the road into Sweetwater County ran straight for 11 miles before it remembered how to bend, and that he had counted every mile of it, slow, the way a man counts coins when he owns exactly one. The land office was a single slumped room with a stove gone cold since spring. Boone Carter sat behind the desk like a prisoner waiting on a verdict. 60 years at least, white at the temples, hands that trembled when he thought the watching had stopped. The deed lay between them, already signed on the seller's line, the ink long dry. You're certain of the price. Garrett's voice came level. A statement wearing the coat of a question. Boone didn't lift his eyes. Price is $1. It was always going to be $1. Land's worth 1,000 times that. More than I've got the words for. The old man finally looked up, and what sat behind his eyes wasn't greed and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to the face of a man setting down a load he'd hauled too far up too steep a grade. That's the whole trouble with it, son. It's worth more than a body can safely hold. Garrett laid the dollar on the wood. It made no sound at all. Boone slid the deed across, then kept 2 fingers pressed to its corner, unwilling for one last breath to let it go. There's a house on the place. Good bones. The roof's been kept up. The well runs sweet. Kept up by who? The question hung in the cold air. Boone's jaw worked, and a long breath went out of him, like the last of something leaving a body. You'll want to learn that for yourself. But hear me, Dalton, and hear me close. Whatever you find inside that house, whoever you find, you do not hand them over to the Maddox brothers. You don't breathe a word to a man named Wade Harlan. You bury that knowledge before you bury anything else you own. Garrett took up the paper and folded it once. And who would the Maddox brothers be? But Boone had already turned his face to the window, his shoulders curling inward, an old man studying a road he had decided not to take. Go on now. The light's burning down, and you've got a long way yet to your own life. The dollar sat folded in his vest pocket, and the deed sat rolled in his saddlebag, and the road west sat open before him, and Garrett Dalton gave his horse its head and let the country do what it wanted with him. Wyoming in late summer smelled of sage and hot rock, and the particular dryness of a place that did not apologize for what it was. He had ridden worse country in his time, uglier country, country that bore no relationship with the word beautiful, and knew it, and did not care. The hills out here were a different proposition. They had a slowness to them that worked on the inside of a man, whether he wanted it to or not, the way a long silence in a room will eventually make even the stubbornest person stop filling it with noise. He had been filling the inside of himself with noise for 6 years. Sarah had been a woman of particular silences. Not a talker, not the way some women are, covering the air with their company to keep the loneliness from finding a foothold. She was quiet in the way a well-built room is quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full of something that does not need to announce itself to be present. He had fallen in love with that quiet before he had fallen in love with anything else about her, which was saying a great deal, because there was a great deal else to fall in love with. Lily had inherited none of it. His daughter had come into the world opinionated and loud and entirely unwilling to let any room she occupied forget she was there. 3 years old, and already she had opinions about which cup the water tasted better from, which corner of the yard the dog was, and was not permitted in, which stories were right for before sleeping and which were not. He used to lie on the floor of the front room in the evenings, with her sitting on his chest arguing at him about one thing or another, and he had been so foolishly certain there would be 10,000 more evenings exactly like it. The fever had come through while he was on the Powder River. 2 weeks' hard ride north, chasing the Army's wars across ground that had nothing to do with anything he loved. He had been riding with the cavalry out of Fort Fetterman. In those years, the long, ugly campaigns of the late 70s, gone for months at a stretch, and telling himself the soldier's wage was how a man loved his family from a distance. Then a hired rider had found him at camp with news that the fever had come through his town, and by the time he made it home, the 2 graves were already dug and filled and settled. Sarah and Lily. 3 years old, his daughter, old enough to run and not old enough to know which way. He had been 400 miles off, earning 6 years gone since, and the figures of that day still refused to add up to anything a man could carry without his arms shaking. He had tried, in the years since, a variety of arrangements for living with it. There was the arrangement where he worked every hour of daylight until the falling dark made working possible, and then slept the dead exhausted sleep that left no room for the particular sort of dream he was avoiding. There was the arrangement where he moved to a new town every few months, kept no company, made no attachments, became the kind of man whose name the people he'd worked alongside could not quite recall once he'd ridden on. There was the arrangement, arrived at in the deep of certain sleepless nights, where he was simply honest with himself about the fact that none of it was working. And then there was this one, 100 acres, $1. The deed in the saddlebag and the hills opening ahead in the long gold afternoon and the noise inside him going, not quiet exactly, but less. He was not a superstitious man. He did not put stock in signs or in any particular interest God was supposed to take in the small arrangements of individual lives. But he thought about what old Boone Carter had said at the very last, the words thrown over the shoulder like an afterthought, and he thought about the way Boone's hands had not stopped shaking the entire time they sat in that cold room together. And he thought about a man who had spent 6 years learning the cost of 400 miles and of every mile in between. Whatever was on that ranch, he would not be riding away from it. He was certain of that much before the chimney smoke came into view over the last rise. He crested the hill, and there it was, thin, gray, rising straight and steady from the chimney of a house that the deed in his pocket said had stood empty for 3 years. Garrett reined up and sat his horse a long moment without moving, because abandoned houses do not keep fires, and kept fires mean kept houses, and Boone Carter's careful, frightened words came back to him all in a rush. Whatever you find inside that house, whoever you find. He swung down at the rail and crossed the yard with his hand resting near his coat and his pulse doing something it had not done since the campaigns. The front door was not barred. It swung inward on a long iron groan, and the inside of the house stopped him where he stood. Not because of ruin, because of the absence of it. The floor swept clean. A pot hung over coals banked low and tended. Dried flowers stood in a tin cup at the center of the table, and a quilt lay folded into a careful square over the back of a chair, and the whole place carried the warm, impossible weight of somewhere a living person actually made their days. Then the stairs spoke. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy, in a manner all their own. Descending, Garrett's hand went to his coat. "I've got a gun, most men do," a woman's voice, calm and a little tired. "I don't carry one. So let's the both of us keep our hands where they ought to be and see how that goes." She came down into the light at the foot of the stairs, and his hand fell away from his coat without waiting for his permission. She was a large woman, truly large, broad through the shoulders, and fuller still below them, her frame heavy and substantial under a brown cotton dress, patched at one elbow and gone pale at every seam from washing. She came down the last steps with the slow, deliberate placement of a person who had spent a lifetime learning how to move a great deal of herself through a world built narrow and unaccommodating. Her face was round and full, the cheeks carrying the deep shadow of dimples even now, when nothing in her was smiling, a soft second curve beneath the chin. Her hair was brown gone gold at the loose ends, tied back behind her neck, and there were freckles, a scattering of them spilled across the bridge of her nose and the high round of each cheek, and her hands where they rested at her sides were broad and capable and work-worn. But it was the eyes that held him, dark brown and steady and carrying a thing he recognized the way a man recognizes something he has seen in his own mirror. The look of a person who has been afraid for so long that fear has quietly become the floor under their feet. Ordinary now, no longer worth the trembling. You'd be the new owner then, not a question. Boone went and sold it. For $1, something crossed her round face, a near cousin to a smile, a nearer one to grief, that has the sound of Boone all over it. Selling off a thing he only ever held in trust. Held in trust for who? She crossed to the window instead of answering, drew the faded curtain back a single inch, looked out at the grass running gold to the foot of the hills. When she turned back to him, she had decided something behind those steady eyes. Maybelle Foster. The few who knew me well enough called me May, and there aren't many of those left walking. I have lived in this house 3 years. I keep the roof patched and the well sweet and the fences from tumbling into the creek. And I expect now I'll be trespass on you instead of on a dead man's memory. Boone's not dead. I just bought a ranch off him an hour ago. Not Boone, she said it low. My father, Henry Foster. This was his ground long before it was ever anybody else's. Garrett set his satchel down on the table beside the tin cup of dried flowers, and the careful ordered future he had ridden 3 hours to claim shifted under his boots and began, quietly, to slide. Then you'd best tell me, the whole of it, because no man sells off 100 acres for the price of a cup of coffee just to keep a small secret. He only does it to keep a large one. May Foster studied him a long moment, the way she had surely studied every stranger who crossed her path in 3 years, sorting the truly dangerous from the merely cruel and the merely cruel from the rare harmless few. Then she went to the stove and poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Her hands moved quick and certain, the broad, capable hands of a woman who had kept herself alive on nothing but her own labor. She set 1 cup before him and wrapped both of her own around the other as though to warm them. Though the day outside had turned hot, my father came west in '74. A prospector, but a real one. Not some fool with a tin pan and a dream. He knew rock the way a horseman knows horses. He could read a dry stream like other men read a page of scripture. A flicker of old pride lit through the tiredness. He found silver up in the hills behind this house. Not a trickle, not a pocket, a vein. The richest claim in the whole territory, he told me, and my father was not a man given to large words about small things. He filed on it. Legal, filed it, mapped it, walked every foot of those hills across 2 years, setting down on paper, where the ore ran deep and where it pinched away to nothing. Her thumb moved slow around the rim of the cup, and then 2 men came up from Denver. Silas Maddox and his brother Roy, Maddox Mining Company. They wanted to buy the claim outright. My father told them no. 3 months later they told the county he'd died in a cave-in. There it was. The name Old Boone had been too frightened to speak. Garrett felt the room drop a degree colder. My father knew rock better than any man in this territory. He'd have walked into a burning barn before he'd set foot in an unsupported shaft, and he never once went down without checking the timbers first. Her voice did not break. It had broken a long while ago and set wrong, the way an untended bone sets wrong, and now it simply held its crooked shape and bore the weight. He didn't die by the mountain's hand. The mountain got the blame for it, and then those 2 brothers came down here with papers. A deed, a will. Both of them forged, both signed in a hand that was never his, by men who have never once seen the inside of an honest courtroom. And this town believed every word, because the town will believe 2 men with money and a lawyer out of Denver, over a dead prospector and over his daughter. She made a small, quick gesture down the broad length of herself. There and gone before he could be sure he'd seen it. Over a daughter who looks like me. Garrett held his tongue. There was nothing he could put into that silence that would not come out smaller than what it deserved. They took the mine. They took this house, on paper. They took the whole of the valley my father bled into. She set the cup down with a small final click. What they did not take is the thing he hid before they killed him, because he knew they were coming for him. He was a careful man to the last hour of his life. She crossed to the fireplace and knelt, slow, 1 broad hand braced on the cold stone for balance, the other reaching to a floorboard that looked in every way identical to the dozen boards around it. Her fingers found the hidden edge, pried it up. From the dark beneath she drew a flat tin box wrapped in oilcloth, and she stood with it pressed against her chest the way a person holds a thing rescued from a flood, the original deed. Filed and stamped and sealed before the Maddox forgeries ever existed, the survey maps in his own hand. And his journal. She set the box on the table and opened the lid carefully, the way you open something that cannot be replaced. There is enough in here to hang both brothers and the Denver lawyer who taught them their letters in deceit. Every page is a length of rope. Garrett looked at the papers spread open in the lamplight and felt the trap close gently and completely around his $1 life, with the soft certainty of a thing that had been waiting for him a long time. "Then why are you still here?" he asked. 3 years with a rope in a box. Why not ride for a marshal? Because I have tried. For the first time her composure thinned, and beneath it he saw exactly how worn down she truly was, worn the way a stone step wears, smooth and gradual and total. "Every time I ride farther than half a day from this valley, Wade Harlan finds me on the road. The Maddox brothers keep a paid man in every town within 100 miles, watching for a large woman, traveling alone. The one honest lawman I know sits in Sweetwater, and there is no road to his door that does not pass under somebody's bought eyes." She closed the lid. "So I stay. I keep the house. I wait. And I tell myself that one day the right thing will come riding down that road instead of the wrong one." The look she gave him then was not hope. It was too guarded for that, too careful by 3 years of habit. But it was hope's near relation, and he could see it cost her something just to let it show. And out beyond the walls, far off and steadily closer, came the sound of horses moving fast. May Foster moved to the window, faster than a woman her size had any business moving, and the coffee jumped in both cups at the suddenness of it. She drew the curtain back a single inch and looked out, and every trace of color drained from her round face at once. "Not today," almost a whisper. "It cannot be today. He is months too soon." Garrett was beside her. 3 riders coming down the north trail, still small with the distance but moving in that loose spread-out way of men who hunt other men for their wages, wide apart, covering angles, not travelers. Hunters who? The one in front, black hat. There is a scar that runs the whole left side of his face. Her voice had gone tight as strung wire. "That is Wade Harlan. He rides the Maddox brothers' dirty work for them." She turned to him, and the careful guarding had fallen clean off her face, replaced by something rawer underneath. "He comes through twice a year to look the property over, make sure no soul is living on it, stays the one night and moves on. But it is not the season for him. He is 3 full months early." Her dark eyes searched his. "Someone told him. Someone in Sweetwater watched a stranger buy this ground for $1 and carried the word straight to the Maddox men. Boone," Garrett thought, or the clerk who witnessed the deed, or any of a dozen idle men who had seen him ride out that morning toward land nobody else would take as a gift. "Go up the stairs." He kept it quiet and level. "Stay low and stay quiet. This is my house." The steel came back into her voice all at once. "I have hidden in it for 3 years. I am sick to the back teeth of the upstairs. It is my house now, by your own telling. Bought and signed and legal." He kept the edge out of it. No hardness, no challenge. Just the plain fact laid down gently. "And the man riding in does not know a single living thing about you being here. Let us hold that card back from the table. Just the one." She held his eyes a beat past comfort, and he held hers, and then she gave a single sharp nod and moved toward the stairs with a speed and quiet that would have surprised anyone who had not yet watched her move when she had a reason to. But she stopped on the second step, where the shadow came down and swallowed her, and her hand reached behind the banister and came back with a shotgun, old and oiled and plainly kept ready against exactly this kind of afternoon. "I will be right here," she said from the dark of the step. "Whatever happens out on that porch, I am going to be standing right here." Garrett moved to the door. The afternoon light hit him full when he stepped out onto the porch, throwing his shadow long across the gray, weathered boards. He kept his hands easy at his sides and his face easier than that, and he looked at the 3 riders, coming into the yard the way he had once looked at difficult terrain before moving into it, reading where the trouble lived and where it didn't. The lead rider sat his horse, like a man who believed the earth produced horses and ground, and standing men for his personal convenience. The scar ran pale from his left temple, down past the jaw to the chin, old and settled into the skin. His eyes were the flat, colorless kind that a man arrives at after he has spent whatever it was that made other men hesitate. His right hand rested on the saddle horn a single inch from the butt of his gun. "Boone Carter." The scarred man called it out without raising his voice, the particular confidence of a man who is used to being heard. "Come on out here, old man. We have got some accounts between us that want settling. Boone is not here." Garrett kept it flat and plain, nothing added. "I am Garrett Dalton. I bought this ranch off him this morning. So whatever accounts you are carrying." They rode south out of the county with the man who used to own the place. The scarred man blinked, once, slow. The flat eyes traveled over Garrett from the boots up, taking inventory, and behind them something recalculated a sum it had thought was finished. "Bought it." A grin spread below the scar, wide and empty of warmth. "Now that does surprise me, friend. Old Boone swore on everything he owned he would die on this ground. makes a fellow wonder what he knew about the place that turned him so suddenly eager to be shut of it. Could not tell you. We did not sit down and trade our histories. No, the man swung down from the saddle, unhurried, his spurs chiming once against the packed dirt of the yard. His 2 men stayed mounted, and Garrett watched them ease their horses wide without a word passing between them, one drifting left and one drifting right, until they had the porch covered from 3 angles. Practiced, the geometry of men who had done this many times before. He marked it and said nothing of it. But a man buys 100 acres of worked-out grass for what exactly? Do not tell me a sensible fellow pays good money for ground. Nobody has touched in 3 years. Price is between me and the man who sold it. It is between you and a fair number of people, friend. You just do not know their names yet. The scarred man came to the foot of the porch steps, close enough now that Garrett could smell the horse on him and the gun oil and the day's work. See, this property has got a history to it. Things were left behind when the last owner passed on. Valuables, you might call them. Items that need finding their way back to the people they rightfully belong to. We only rode out to walk the place over and make certain nothing has gone and grown legs. Nothing on this ranch belongs to anybody but me. Garrett let his hand drift, slow and plainly visible, toward the splitting axe he had leaned against the doorframe that morning. Not reaching for it, only letting the scarred man know that it was there, and that the distance to it was not very far, and I do not recall sending out any invitations to come and walk it. That checked the man for half a breath. Behind the flat eyes something turned over, weighing what it found and not entirely liking the weight of it. You do not want to be standing in this particular place, friend. Harlan's voice dropped, went almost neighborly, which was worse than the threat plain. 3 of us, 1 of you, and a carpenter by the look of those hands. We are not here for trouble with you. We only want a quiet walk through that house, and then we ride off and leave you to your grass and your dollar and your peaceful new life. The door opened behind Garrett. His stomach went cold. May Foster stepped out onto the porch with the shotgun up and level, her round full face set as hard as the granite shouldering up out of the hills at the ranch's back. She had changed nothing about herself, hidden nothing, apologized for nothing. She simply stood there, the whole solid, unashamed weight of her filling the doorway, the gun absolutely steady in her 2 broad hands. You are not walking through anything, Wade. Her voice carried clean across the yard to every corner of it. Not this house, not this porch, not 1 more inch of the ground my father bled to keep. Wade Harlan went still all over. The grin slid off his scarred face like something that had never truly belonged there. Maybelle Foster, he breathed it slow, the way a hunter breathes when he finds a track he had given up on finding. 3 years. 3 whole years we had you marked down for dead somewhere up in Montana, and here you sit, right on top of the one thing in this world that... Do not. The shotgun did not move a fraction. Do not put his name in that mouth. And here was the thing Garrett would carry in him long after this day had burned itself out and cooled. It was not the gun, it was the way she stood behind it. A woman the world had spent all 24 years of her life instructing to fold herself smaller, to take up less room, to say sorry for the space she could not help but fill. Standing now at the full and undiminished size of herself in that doorway, a dead man's shotgun held in her capable hands, refusing to be 1 inch less than every bit of who she was. The 2 mounted men shifted, their hands beginning their slow reaching. Garrett stepped sideways to the edge of the porch, splitting their attention between himself and the woman. His own hand closing on the smooth, worn handle of the axe. Easy. He pitched the word to carry to all 3 of them at once. Everybody's hands move slow from here on. 3 of you and 2 of us, and a scattergun that will empty the front 2 of you out of your saddles before the man on the end clears leather. That is bad arithmetic any way a person runs it. Harlan's flat eyes moved from the shotgun to the axe to Garrett's face, and Garrett watched him run the same figures and come up with the same grim answer. You do not know what you have put your boot into, carpenter. Harlan began walking backward toward his horse, slow, his gaze fixed on the gun. This woman is wanted, sitting on stolen property. You shelter her and you are an accessory under the law. You stand on that porch with her, and you are standing with her all the way down to the bottom of it. Funny thing about bottoms, Garrett's voice did not move off its level. I rode 3 years with the cavalry out of Fort Fetterman in the late 70s, campaigned across some of the meanest country God ever put on this earth. I have seen a good many bottoms. They are never quite as far down as men of your particular trade like a fellow to believe. Something passed between them then in the silence. the quiet recognition of one hard man measuring another, and Harlan did not care for what the measuring turned up. Silas Maddox rides through here in 3 days. He reached his horse and put a boot in the stirrup and swung up without taking his eyes from the porch. He does not travel light, and he does not travel friendly. You go and think hard on what your dollar actually bought you out here, Carpenter. Think on it real carefully. He reined the horse around. 3 days, Maybelle. You make the most of what is left of your daddy's house. He put his heels in. His 2 men swung in behind him without a word between them, and the 3 riders went back up the north trail, with the dust rising gold behind their horses until the sound of the hooves thinned out into the wide afternoon, and the country swallowed every last trace of them. For a long moment neither Garrett nor May moved at all. Then she lowered the shotgun, and her broad hands had begun to tremble, and he saw that it was not fear working in them. It was the cost of having held them dead stills against everything I'd heard her that had wanted to shake. You could have handed me over. She kept her eyes on the place where the dust still hung settling on the trail. The moment you counted 3 of them, you could have stepped aside and kept your ranch and slept sound tonight and never given me a second thought. Most men in your position would have done exactly that and felt sensible for it. 8, a breath. Why didn't you? Garrett leaned the axe back against the door frame. He looked out at the same settling dust, and the answer came up out of a place in him he had kept bolted for 6 years. I had a wife and a little girl. His voice came out rough with disuse. And on the one day in all the world they needed me to be close, I was 400 miles off in an army camp chasing a soldier's wage. I told myself I was building toward their future. I told myself a great many sensible things. He stopped, made himself go on. When I got back, there was nothing of either of them left to come home to, but 2 filled graves. And I have spent every day in the 6 years since wishing I had been the kind of man who stayed. He turned and looked at her, and there was nothing left in him resembling performance, only the plain bare fact of it. I do not intend to be 400 miles off the next time somebody is standing alone needing a man to stand with them. That is the whole of it. It is not courage. It is the only thing I have got left in me that I can still do right. May Foster looked at him then, looked at him the way a person looks when they have forgotten. That kind of looking is even possible. And in those dark, tired, careful eyes, something shifted that had not shifted in 3 long years. A small letting down of a weight she had carried. So far she had stopped feeling it as separate from her own body. Henry Foster, she said quietly, my father. He used to tell me a man's worth was never in what he managed to own. It was in what he would plant his feet in front of and refuse to move away from. A faint, worn ghost of a smile touched the corners of her full mouth. He would have taken to you, I think. And he did not take to many. The sun was going down behind the hills now, laying the whole valley over in copper and deepening rose. They stood together on the porch of a house bought for $1, a widowed carpenter and a hunted woman the world had labored all her life to make smaller, and they watched the light go out of the sky. 3 days, Garrett said at last. 3 days. May turned the shotgun over slowly in her hands. It is not enough time to run, not from Silas. I have tried running from that man before, and running is exactly how I learned the true length of his reach. Then we do not run. He said it the way he would call a board true or a joint square. We use the 3 days. You told me your father's box could hang them. But paper cannot climb into a witness stand and swear an oath. A sheriff can listen, though, and a court can hang. You said there is an honest one over in Sweetwater, Eli Bennett. She nodded slowly, the thought working behind her eyes. He believed me from the start. He never had enough in his hands to move on. Maddox owns the judges between here and the capital. Bennett would need a great deal more than a grieving daughter, and a box of papers a Denver lawyer can call forgeries before his coffee cools. Then we get him more. Garrett picked up his satchel from the table through the open door. Come inside. Show me everything that box holds, page by page. If there is a rope in there, I want to know its full length before I go putting my own neck anywhere near the loose end of it. She went in ahead of him, and as Garrett moved to follow, he caught his own reflection dim in the dark window glass and stopped, just for a single breath, because the man looking back at him from the glass was checking the loads in a Colt revolver he had not drawn in 6 years. His hands moving over the cylinder with an old and terrible ease he had believed buried for good, alongside 2 small graves, on a hillside 400 miles east of here. Inside, May had touched a match to the lamp and spread the contents of the tin box across the table in the warm circle of light. The deed, the maps, the journal, its cover gone soft and dark with the oil of a hand that had opened it 1,000 times. She unrolled the largest of the survey maps and set river stones on the four corners to hold it flat. Her father's hand covered the whole of it, fine and exact, a draftsman's patient care living in every line, elevations, compass bearings, the black tracery of the silver-bearing rock threading down through the hills like the veins through the back of a working hand. He set down everything, she said, her voice gone quiet with the nearness of the dead man in the ink, every drift, every face, where the ore ran rich, and where it played out to nothing. Garrett leaned over the map, and his eye trained one starving winter in the Colorado diggings, where he had swung a hammer for a wage, and learned to read ground the way ground wanted to be read, snagged on a thing she had passed over 1,000 times without the knowledge to name it, a second set of marks, thinner than the rest, drawn in a different ink, redder, running underneath the black tracery and deeper than it, following the same hills but lower down into the bones of them. May, he set his finger near the red lines, careful not to touch the page. What is this? She frowned and bent in close beside him, the warmth of her coming near. I never knew. Father drew that the last month of his life. I always took it for a correction, a second guess at his own work. It never seemed to matter much. The silver was the thing that counted. The silver was what they murdered him for. It was not the silver. Garrett's mouth had gone dry. He had seen this exact notation once before, in an assay office in Leadville, scratched on a map that made 3 men wealthy and put a 4th in the cold ground. These red marks. This is gold. Your father was not tracing silver here. He found gold underneath it, a vein running deeper than the silver and richer by a long sight. And from the dates penciled beside these lines, he found it in the last weeks of his life. He straightened slowly. He may not have lived long enough to file a claim on it at all. May Foster sat down. Not gracefully, not with any of the careful deliberateness she usually brought to the business of moving herself through the world. All at once, dropping into the chair as though the strings holding her upright had been cut clean through. Her 2 broad hands came up and covered her mouth. Gold. The word came out of her small as a child's. They killed him for the silver, and they never once knew about the. She could not finish it. A claim like this is worth half the territory. Garrett looked at the red lines running their secret course beneath the black. It explains the dollar, May. Boone was not selling you a curse. He was hiding the richest ground in all of Wyoming, under the one roof nobody would think to look at twice. And he handed it to a stranger he had never laid eyes on, because he was old and frightened and clean out of time, and he staked the whole thing on the gamble, that the right man might still come riding down a Wyoming road, if a person left the door cracked open for him. In the lamplight, May Foster lowered her hands from her face, and for the first time since he had walked in through her door, the fear that had been the floor beneath her feet cracked clean through, and in the crack Garrett saw the woman her father must have known. Sharp. Whole, solid as the rock her father had spent a lifetime reading. She had finally been given a reason to stop hiding, and the reason had changed the whole shape of her face. 3 days, she said. But it was a different 3 days now, sitting different in her mouth, not a countdown. A length of rope being measured out for a specific purpose. They worked the box together until the lamp burned low, and Garrett read the journal aloud in the places where her catching breath kept stopping her short. The pages turned from a careful man's quiet accounting of weather and flour prices into something harder and more urgent. The handwriting pressing deeper into the page as the weeks wore on, the threats arriving in the entries dressed as business offers, a county surveyor who came to check a boundary and left with the whole claim sketched into a notebook of his own, a foreman bought, a lawyer from Denver who smiled like a man who had already written the ending of the story and was only waiting for the other people in it to catch up. He read the last clear entry twice, because the second time it meant more than the first. The line where Henry Foster wrote that a hungry man with a small fortune was a dangerous creature, and a hungry man who learned there was a larger one beneath his feet would burn the whole world to the bedrock to get at it. He wrote it the way a man writes, a thing he understands from the bones outward, and reading it in that kept house by the low lamp, Garrett felt the truth of it, sitting heavy and plain on the table between them. He found it and hid it, May said when the reading was done. Her hand stood flat on the journal's closed cover, as though the warmth of her palm might pass through the cloth and reach the pages beneath. He did not even file it. He carried the whole of it in his own head and in these red lines and nowhere else on this earth. And then he walked down into a shaft somebody had pulled the timbers out of, and it nearly died right there with him. She looked up, almost, but not quite, because he left it to me, and now I have gone and left the upstairs for good. Garrett reached for the journal before she could fold it away with the maps. Not grabbing, just a hand lay gently on the cover, a question in the gesture. May looked at his hand, then at his face, and after a moment she left it where it was and sat back across the lamp from him. The last entries, he said. May I read them to you? Out loud she looked at him a moment. Then she nodded once. He opened it near the back, where the pages had gone soft from being turned more than the rest, and he read the way a man reads a thing that belongs to someone sitting in the same room, slow and out loud, because it seemed wrong to let a dead father's words stay locked inside a single pair of eyes when his daughter was close enough to hear them. The early entries of the final month were short. The hand still careful, still exact, but the lines pressed into the page with more weight than the earlier pages carried, the way a man writes when he is running out of time and will not say so plainly. Notes about the mine. A record of a visit from Roy Maddox that read like a warning wearing the coat of a courtesy call. A line about the high trails growing difficult with the turning of the season, and beneath it, almost as an afterthought, the first mention of the red lines on the survey map. Garrett read it aloud. The entry where Henry Foster wrote that he had gone back down to the east face and found what he had thought last week was a fault line in the lower quartz. It was not a fault. He had sat down on the rock and looked at it a long time before he would let himself believe what he was seeing. May had gone very still across the table. He turned the page. The next entry, the color was unmistakable to anyone who had put 20 years into learning rock, and Henry Foster had put 20 years into learning rock. A band of quartz running through the lower east face, carrying gold in quantities he had not seen outside of the old Colorado strikes, and those had been the richest diggings the country produced in a generation. He had not gone back up for 2 hours. He had sat on a powder keg in the east chamber and thought about Maybelle. The fire in the stove had burned to almost nothing now, the coals casting their low red wash across the floorboards, and in that light May Foster sat with her hands flat on the table, and her dark eyes fixed on the journal, and her face doing something complicated and private that Garrett kept his own eyes away from. He read on. The entry where Henry wrote that his daughter was 21 years old, that she had her mother's stubbornness, which was the finest thing he knew how to say about another person, and that she had a mind for numbers and for rock that he had pretended to himself she had gotten from him, though her mother would have corrected that and been right to do it. That she did not yet know the full size of what she was capable of, that this was partly his fault, that he had kept her close and kept her safe, and in doing so had perhaps kept her from learning that full size. May made a small sound. Not a word, just a breath catching wrong. Garrett kept his eyes on the page and kept reading. The entry where Henry wrote that he had decided he would not tell her about the gold until the silver claim was settled safe in the hands of the law, where the Maddox brothers could not reach it. That a secret shared was a secret halved, that he could not put this particular secret in his daughter's hands and ask her to carry it through a world that already wanted what he had and was not inclined to ask politely for it. He turned to the last page. The handwriting had changed here. Not dramatically, but enough. The letters slightly wider, the lines not quite as even, the way a man's hand changes when he is finally writing something he has needed to write for a long time, and has only now allowed himself to sit down and begin. He read it slowly. The entry where Henry Foster wrote that he would tell her in time. He would tell her that her father had found the thing of a lifetime under the ground he loved, and that he had thought of her face. In the first minute he understood what he was looking at. Before he thought of any price or any claim or any consequence, he would tell her that every foot of those hills he had spent 10 years walking, he had been walking towards something that was always going to be hers. Not because the gold was worth what it was worth in dollars, though it was worth more than he could write in the book without his hand shaking, but because she deserved to know that the ground she had grown up standing on was ground her father had walked into from love and mapped from love and refused to leave from love. And he wanted her to know that from him, before she heard it from anyone else or from no one at all. Garrett stopped reading. The journal lay open between them. The last full entry of a man who had known the wolves were circling and had written his daughter a letter in the margins of a mining journal and never lived long enough to hand it to her. May Foster was weeping. Not loudly, not in the collapsed way. Grief sometimes takes a person by force. She wept the way the very strong weep, when the thing they have been holding finally finds the crack it has been looking for all along, steadily, without looking away from the page, the tears running down the full round of her cheeks and dropping silently onto the table between her hands. Garrett closed the journal with great care and set it on top of the folded maps. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the silence, and he had learned enough about grief to know that the impulse to fill another person's with words is a kindness meant for the speaker, and not for the one doing the grieving. After a while she reached across and put her hand flat over the journal's cover. "He never told me," she said it quietly and without accusation, simply the plain, honest statement of a daughter sitting across from the fact of her father. "He kept all of it in here. The threats, the fear, the gold, She pressed the cover gently. "He kept talking to me about the school back east. The silver was going to pay for a real education," he said, "a proper one. He would describe the classrooms, and I would pretend to be interested in classrooms, when what I was interested in was the rock, same as him. But he could not see it because he was too busy building me a different future than the one I actually wanted. He saw it in the end." Garrett nodded at the journal. He wrote it down. "He knew what you were capable of. He was only afraid of how much he loved it, because loving a thing that openly is the same as showing the world exactly where to aim." May looked at him across the guttering lamp. "I know that fear," she said quietly. "I have been living inside it for 3 years, keeping the curtains half drawn, making myself easy to overlook." She pulled her hand slowly back from the journal, the way a person lets go of a hand at a graveside. "I think I have been tired of being easy to overlook for a long time. I think I have only just now found the nerve to say so." Garrett looked at this woman sitting across the failing light from him, this woman who had survived 3 years of wolves at the door, and a town that had thrown her out, and a grief carried entirely alone in a kept house, and who had just heard her dead father's love for her read out of the margins of a mining journal, and who was sitting upright with her hands flat on the table and her eyes clear. Not brittle, not about to break. Clear in the way that comes after the worst of the storm has passed through and the air has gone very still. "Your father was right," he said, "about the full size of you." He looked at her steadily. He just did not know yet how right he was going to turn out to be. The lamp burned down past trimming, and May let it gutter out entirely. The fire in the stove had dropped to coals that threw a low red wash across the floorboards, and in that light she moved around the kitchen with the quiet purpose of a woman, putting her own house to rights for the night, setting the cups back on the shelf, folding the maps into their oilcloth with the careful hands of someone handling what could not be replaced. Garrett dragged the heaviest chair against the door and settled into it with the Colt across his knees and his back flat to the wall, the old instinct from 100 nights in the field returning without being asked for. "You will be cold before the small hours?" May was lifting the quilt from the chair where it had sat folded. Since he first walked in that morning, the ring of faded stars worked into the cloth. She crossed the room and held it out over the dark between them. He looked at it a moment. "That is yours. It was my mother's before it was mine, and her mother's before that. 3 women's hands made that quilt in the winters before I was born." She pressed it toward him when he did not take it. "It has kept me warm 3 years in a house with no other company. It can carry 1 more night." He took it. The cloth was so soft with age it felt more like something worn than something woven. The stars faded nearly to the color of the background, so they were more felt than seen. He sat with it across his knees and said nothing for a moment, because the simple domestic weight of it in his hands undid something in him. He had believed long past the reach of undoing. "Thank you," he said, 2 words carrying considerably more than 2 words could reasonably hold. "Do not thank me. I need you awake and not frozen through come morning, if you are going to be any use on whatever road we are riding." The briskness of it was something she was wearing over something softer, and they both understood that, and neither of them chose to remark on it. She turned toward the stairs. Then she stopped, on the second step, half in the shadow and half out of it, the way she had stopped the first time, as though the threshold between the dark and the light was a place she could say things she could not say in either one alone. Garrett, Dalton, May. She was quiet for a moment, finding the words in the dark, or deciding whether to use the ones she had already found. "My father used to say that the loneliest thing in the world is not being without people. He said a person can stand in a room full of souls who know their name and be lonelier than the last man on the last mountain. The real loneliness," he said, "was being in the world without one single soul who truly saw you." She did not turn around. "I have been alone in the way he meant for 3 years. Since the day I walked out of Silver Creek with one dress to my name and nowhere on this earth to put my next step. Not short of bodies, mind you. Wade Harlan and his men have come through twice a year regular as the frost. But alone in the way that counts. Garrett kept very still and let her finish. And then you walked through that door this morning, she went on, her voice careful and low, and entirely unlike the voice that had faced Harlan down on the porch. And I watched you all afternoon. The way you read my father's maps without once touching them until I said it was all right. The way you looked at this house, at the dried flowers in that cup, like it was a real place somebody actually lived in, and not just a ruin to be felt sorry for, a breath uneven at its edges. You saw me, Garrett, from the first minute, not the problem on the property, not the large woman sitting on a dead man's ground. Me. Maybelle Foster. She said it the way a person states a fact they are still slightly disbelieving of. That is a new thing in my life. I wanted it said out loud while there was still tonight to say it in case tomorrow does not leave room for it. The fire ticked quietly in the stove. The dark held them, gentle for once, undemanding. May. His voice came rough with something he had not used in a long time. What you just said. I want you to know I heard every word of it. He stopped and found the rest of it. And I want you to know that sitting here in your father's chair with your mother's quilt and a gun I have not touched in 6 years, on the night before a very uncertain 3 days, is the first time since I stood in front of 2 filled graves that I have felt like a man living in a present tense. Not a past I am running from, not a future I am trying to earn back, just here, tonight. In a kept house with something in it worth keeping, the fire said what neither of them did after that, quietly in the language of coals going to ash. Go to sleep, she said at last, from the second step. Warm, in a way she had not quite been all day. I will be listening from above. You call me if anything moves on that trail before the light comes. He listened to her climb. The careful, full measured placing of each step, the rope frame of the old bed above him taking her weight with a long, slow creak, and then the stillness settling in around the house like water finding its level. And after a while, not very long, which told him more than she probably meant for it to, the slow, even breathing of a person who had not trusted a night enough to truly rest inside it for years, letting this one hold her. He sat awake in the chair and watched the door, and held the quilt with its faded stars, and kept the loaded Colt across his knees, and the night wore down around the house, with the patience of the country outside, slow and wide and entirely without hurry. It wore a long way down. When the sound finally came, it came from the south, from the secret road that should have known no footstep but her own, the slow, careful pick of a single horse, finding its way along ground it knew well and did not want to announce arriving on. Garrett's hand closed on the Colt before his eyes were fully open, and above him he heard the instant silence of a woman who had been listening the whole time. He was already out of the chair by the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, and the lamp was already dark, and the question on his face met the answer on hers across the gray and breathless kitchen. And neither of them spoke because the voice coming out of the dark from the yard had already done it for them. Old and cracked and carrying the weight of a thing 3 years overdue, a man's voice, pitched low to carry no further than necessary, calling her name, telling her not to shoot, telling her he had come a very long way and had not got the wind left to come a second time. Garrett held May back in the dark with a hand on her arm and made her wait, because a secret road and a ghost arriving on it one night, before they meant to ride for the law, was a thing that wanted thinking before it wanted opening. He held her there until the old man outside said the one thing that settled it. That he had seen what they did to her father, that he had carried it 3 years, that it was killing him now faster than his own ruined lungs, and he had come to give the truth to somebody who would use it, and he would say it to the porch in the dark if he had to. Garrett lowered the Colt, not all the way but enough. That is not a man laying a trap, he said quietly. That is a man laying down a load. I know the difference. I have carried the second kind myself long enough to recognize it in another. He looked at her in the near dark. Open it, but I am standing where I can see his hands the whole time. May reached for the cold iron latch. Her broad fingers trembled against it, and she let them tremble. And she lifted the latch and pulled the door open on the gray breaking edge of a dawn that was going to change everything, and the dying old man came leaning into the lamplight with 3 years of held truth shining raw in his eyes, and Garrett Dalton understood in that moment that whatever the next 3 days had been going to be, they had just become something faster and harder and a great deal more dangerous than anything $1 had ever bought any man before. Dawn came up the color of cold ash over the creek bottom. The kind of light that does not promise a good day so much as issue a warning about one. Garrett checked the cinch on Pete Hardin's borrowed horse for the third time. Not because it needed checking, because his hands wanted work, and there was no other kind to give them. The old man was already in the saddle, hunched forward, gray as the sky above him. One fist knotted in the mane the way a child grips a railing on a steep stair. Every few breaths the cough took him, and he rode it out with his eyes pressed shut, and his jaw set, and his whole body clenched around the effort of simply continuing to be upright. Garrett watched him from the corner of his eye and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Pete Hardin was dying. That was not a new fact this morning. It had been true when the old man arrived at the door in the dark, and it had been true through the hours they had spent inside, by the guttering fire, while Pete told them everything he had carried for 3 years in the low, careful voice of a man confessing a long and serious sin. What was new this morning was that the dying man intended to get on a horse and ride with them anyway, and no argument Garrett had tried between first light and now had moved him a single inch on the question. He cannot do this pace. Garrett kept it low, meant for May alone, the two of them standing apart from the horses in the gray yard. Look at him. He will not make a hard ride. If Harlan comes back early and finds us still on the flat ground with a man who cannot run, then we do not ride hard. May was cinching the flat leather satchel against the small of her back, the maps and the journal and the deed wrapped in their oilcloth inside it. Her hands moved with the quick, certain economy he had already learned to read, as her thinking face, the one she wore when the decision was already made and she was simply executing it. And he is not staying here alone for Harlan to find on his rounds. You saw what was in that man's face last night, Garrett. He did not ride up a road he can barely sit a horse on just to hand us his story and watch us leave. He came to finish something. You take the finish away from him now, and you take the last thing he has got left to hold on to. Garrett looked at the old man, swaying in the borrowed saddle against the pale sky. He thought about the last thing a person has left to hold on to, and what's cost to take it from them. And he picked up his own reins without another word on the subject. May took the lead without discussion, the way she had taken it the evening before on the porch. She knew this road, and they did not, and they all three understood that the knowing was what mattered this morning. She rode the creek-bottom trail with the sure, unhurried confidence of someone reading a familiar page, her eyes already on the next thing before the last thing was behind her. Where the trail forked at a boulder that had been split clean down its middle by some old frost, she went left without slowing. Where the ground softened above a hidden seep and threatened to pull at a horse's feet, she swung wide onto the harder ground at the edge without breaking her pace. Pete Hardin rode between them. He did not talk for the first hour. He sat his horse and breathed and endured, and Garrett rode close enough on the old man's right side to catch him if the enduring ran out before the riding did. The creek bottom was green and close on both sides, the willows leaning their long fingers down toward the water, the light coming through them broken into pieces. It was the kind of trail that would have been pleasant under different circumstances. The air, cool and smelling of water, and turned earth, the creek talking beside them in its low, continuous voice. Under these circumstances, it was simply ground to be covered, and they covered it. It was Pete who broke the silence, and when he did it came out of him the way held water comes through a crack that has been there a long time, not poured but pressed, finding its own path down. Henry was the best of us. He said it to his horse's mane, not to either of them. I have known a good many men who worked rock in this territory, smart ones and reckless ones, and the kind that are both at once, which is the most dangerous kind. Henry Foster was different from all of them. He knew the rock the way a man knows a language he grew up speaking, not learned but felt, and he treated every man who worked for him like that man, had a name and a family and an opinion worth hearing. The cough came, and he rode it out. You do not know what that is worth in a mine until you have worked for the other kind. May had not looked back, but Garrett saw her shoulders, and he saw what was in them. Pete, her voice came gentle. You do not have to do this now. I do, though. The old man's head lifted, and his wet eyes had something in them that the sickness had not yet managed to extinguish. That is the whole of it, girl. I do have to. That is exactly why I got on this horse this morning when every sensible part of my body was telling me to lie down and stop. He paused to breathe. The night before your father died, I went back to the East Drift for a lamp I had left behind, and I saw them down there, Roy Maddox and 2 others from the Maddox crew, working at the support timbers on the lower face. Pulling the wedges, loosening the posts, the creek ran on beside them. Neither Garrett nor May spoke into the silence he left after that. I knew what it was for. Pete's voice had dropped to something barely above the sound of the water. Your father made his afternoon check alone, same hour every day, regular as the noon bell. Every man on that crew knew it. You could set your watch by Henry Foster, going down at 2 o'clock. A long and ragged breath went in and came back out changed. And I climbed back up out of that hole, and I went to my bedroll, and I lay there in the dark, and I let it happen. Because I had nothing. Because I was an old man with bad lungs and no savings, and I told myself that one broke digger's word against the name of Maddox would only mean 2 graves dug instead of 1. May stopped her horse. She turned it full around in the narrow trail until she was facing the old man directly, and Garrett pulled up beside them and held his silence. Because he did not know what was coming out of her, and he understood that whatever it was hers to give and not his to get ahead of. What came was not what he expected. You came, she said it quietly, looking straight at Pete Hardin in the gray morning light. You are dying and you got on a horse you have no business riding, and you found the one road they do not watch, and you came up it in the dark to put the truth in my hands. 3 years late, Pete, she did not soften that part. She let the 3 years sit there between them, acknowledged and owed. But you came. And my father, the man who knew you best and trusted you longest, would not have wanted you in a second grave beside his. He would have wanted you exactly here, doing exactly this. That is the man he was. The old digger broke then, the way the very old break when the thing they have been clenching around finally finds the opening it has been looking for. He wept without shame, the tears cutting clean lines down through the gray stubble of his face. And May reached across the gap between the horses and folded his shaking hand inside her broad, steady one and held it there, neither of them speaking, while the creek ran past and the willows leaned overhead, and the morning moved around them with the indifference of mornings. Garrett looked up at the green roof of Willow and gave them what the moment required, which was the small dignity of his turned head, because he knew that thing the old man was carrying. The lying in the dark while the thing happened. The 100 reasons that were really one reason wearing different coats on different nights. He had his own version of it, 400 miles wide and 6 years deep, and it did not get lighter for the knowing. When Pete had steadied and they started forward again, Garrett brought his horse up alongside the old man's. A man can spend the rest of his life paying down one bad hour, he said. Not to May, not to the trail ahead, to Pete, straight, or he can do what you did this morning. Set the thing down in a place where it will do some good and let the doing of it be the payment. You set it down, Pete. It is down now. Let it stay down. The old man looked over at him with his rheumy eyes, and after a moment something in them shifted. Not healed. Nothing heals that fast or that clean. But settled. The way a thing settles when it has finally been put in the right place. You have got one of those hours yourself, Pete said. I can hear it on you. I have got one of those hours, Garrett agreed. The old man nodded once and faced front and rode on, and no more was said about it, and the creek carried all 3 of them deeper into the climbing morning. They came up out of the creek bottom near midday into a country of low pine ridges and gray granite pushing up through the thin soil like the knuckles of a buried hand. And that was where it went wrong. Garrett felt it before he could name it. The birds. A stand of pine to the left had gone quiet, in the particular way that a stand of pine goes quiet when something that does not belong in it has recently arrived, the held breath of a place where the natural order of things has been interrupted. Then his eye went up to the ridgeline ahead, where the trail funneled between 2 shoulders of standing rock into a passage barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. The kind of ground a man selects when he means to do murder and wants the doing of it to be clean and contained. Off the horses, he kept the words flat and final, no room in them for a question or a delay. To the right rocks, now. All 3 of us. Move. May did not argue. 3 years of staying alive had given her a precise and reliable instinct for which tones of voice to obey without stopping to examine the reasoning behind them. She was out of the saddle and hauling Pete down alongside her, before the last word was out of Garrett's mouth, her broad arms taking the old man's weight without hesitation. The first shot came from the ridgeline as Garrett's boots hit the ground. It hit a horse and the horse screamed, that high, terrible sound that carries further than any other sound a working ranch country makes. And then the whole quiet noon came apart at once into the flat, hard percussion of rifle fire, bouncing off the granite walls of the passage. Garrett rolled behind a boulder and came up with the Colt already in his fist. and threw 2 fast shots up at the powder smoke drifting from the ridge, not aimed to hit, but aimed to make the shooters pull back behind their cover, to buy the 3 seconds he needed to read the ground. May had Pete down behind a fallen pine, her own body placed between the old man and the ridge, without a moment's thought given to the placing of it, the shotgun coming up in her 2 steady hands. How many? She had to shout it above the next volley. Lead sang off the stone above their heads and whined away into the pines behind them. Garrett risked a fast look over the top of the boulder. A flash of black hat on the ridge and below it the pale rope of the scar. 5 or 6 up on the ridge. Harlan is with them. He dropped back down. They knew the road, May. They were waiting on this road. He watched the words land on her. The horror of what they meant arriving behind her eyes like cold water. Because the secret road was not secret. Which meant someone had given it up. Which meant someone had been found and made to give it up. Which meant Boone Carter. Who knew every road Henry Foster had ever walked had been found? Pete. May turned to the old man, sharp and urgent. Did you tell anyone you were coming? Is there any chance someone followed you up the— No, girl. I swear it on Henry's grave I told no living soul. Pete's face had gone the color of the granite. But Boone. Boone Carter knew every road on this valley. If they got to Boone before this morning, no time to finish the thought. A rifleman had broken from the cover of the ridge and was working his way down through the rocks toward the right, slipping from stone to stone, with the practiced ease of a man who had done this kind of work before, and in another 2 minutes he would have an angle on the fallen pine, on May and Pete, on everything worth shooting. Garrett ran the arithmetic the way the campaigns had taught him to run it, fast and cold and without sentiment. He could not hold this ground. Pinned in the open with a flanker working the right, they would be cut to pieces inside 5 minutes. He needed the flanker down and the ridge ducking, and both of those things inside the next 10 seconds, and there was only one way to get them that did not involve staying behind a rock and hoping. May. He caught her eye across the distance between the boulder and the pine. When I move, you put that scattergun on the ridge and you keep their heads down. Both barrels. Do not aim at anything in particular. Noise and smoke. Can you do it? I can do it. No shaking it anywhere. Now, he came up out from behind the boulder and ran straight at the flanker, low and fast and directly at the muzzle, because the one thing a man setting up a flanking position never plans for is the target running at him, instead of away from him. Behind Garrett the shotgun went off once, and then again both barrels, and the ridge pulled back behind its cover as one. The flanker swung his rifle around a half-beat too slow, the barrel finding empty air where Garrett had been a moment before, and Garrett shot him through the chest at 15 feet, and the man sat down against a boulder, with a look of mild and permanent surprise, and did not get up again. Garrett took the man's rifle. Better for this work than the Colt. He put his back to the granite and began taking the ridge apart with it. 2 careful shots, and a pause to read the smoke. 2 shots and a pause. The cold and terrible rhythm of it coming back into his hands, whole and complete. A thing he had buried with 2 small graves, and had apparently not buried deep enough. But he kept one eye on May, because May Foster had reloaded the shotgun and she was not making noise anymore. She had found a natural notch in the fallen pine, and she had laid the barrels across it, and she was waiting, with a patience that her father must have worked years to teach her. The waiting that is not passive but active, that is not absence of action, but the most disciplined form of it. And when a Maddox man broke from the cover of the ridge to rush Garrett's exposed right side, she let him cover half the open ground between the ridge and the boulder, and then she fired, and the man went down and stayed down. Garrett caught the look on her face in the half-second he had to spare for it. Not triumph, not the loosening of relief. The face of a woman who had crossed some interior line she had been approaching for 3 years, and had pulled the crossing up behind her. The face of someone who had finished being prey and understood, in the specific moment of the finishing, exactly what that meant and what it would cost, and had decided to pay it anyway. 3 of yours are down, Wade. Garrett put it across the rocks at full voice, aimed at what remained of the enemy's nerve. You want to die on this ridge for the Maddox payroll? It does not pay any better to dead men. Pull back now and live to spend what they owe you. Silence from the stone above. Then Harlan's voice, ragged with a fury that had been scraped raw by the morning. This is not finished, Carpenter. Not by a country mile. Hooves then, 2 horses, maybe 3, breaking hard away north along the back of the ridge and not stopping. And the noon went quiet again. Just the ringing in Garrett's ears, and the wind in the high pines, and underneath it all, rising through the quiet the way bad news always rises, the wet and laboring sound of Pite trying to pull a breath through something that had stopped working properly. Garrett reached him first. The old man was down on his side behind the fallen pine, both hands pressed flat against his belly, and the dark was spreading between his fingers in the fast, certain way of something that is not going to be stopped. A stray round, or one that had been aimed at May and found Pete instead. The distinction did not matter now, and Garrett did not let himself spend a second on it. No, May was already on her knees in the dirt beside him, the shotgun somewhere behind her and forgotten, her broad hands going over the old man's, trying to add their pressure to the wound. "No, Pete, you came all this way. You do not get to stop here. You do not get to—" "Hush now, girl." The old man's voice had gone almost peaceful. The long-held fierceness of it drained away into the ground beneath him. "Hush. Listen to me. There is not time for the other thing, so you listen, Pete. The notebook." A red bubble at the corner of his mouth, there and gone. Roy keeps it. Strongbox in his office at the mine. Not the desk, the strongbox, and not the front of it neither. There is a false back inside, and behind it a drawer, the right-hand one. I watched him put things away in it 100 times over 3 years, thinking the old man sweeping up was too dumb to notice. His hand came off his own wound, dark and slick, and found May's wrist and closed around it and left its print there. Everything is in it. Every bought judge. The senator's man out of the Capitol, where the stolen money sits in the Denver bank. You get that book into a sheriff's honest hands and they do not just hang the two brothers. They hang the whole rotten tree they grew on. Do not talk like there is an ending coming. Your father. The old man's eyes had begun their drift, moving past her face toward the light coming down broken through the high pines, toward whatever it is the dying move toward in those last minutes that the living cannot follow. When you see him, tell him, Pete, finally. I will tell him. She was weeping now, openly, without apology, the way Pete had wept in the creek bottom an hour ago. I will tell him you came back. I will tell him you were brave at the end, Pete. I will tell him every word of it, I swear it to you. But the old man's hand had gone loose on her wrist. His face had eased into something close to the beginning of a smile, the smile of a man setting down a thing he has carried too far, and feeling the relief of the ground coming up to take the weight. And Pete Hardin, who had carried one terrible night for 3 years, and ridden up a dying man's road to lay it down at the last possible hour, let go of all of it at once and was still. The wind moved in the high pines. A horse shifted somewhere behind them in the rocks. The creek below the trail went on talking in its low voice about nothing and everything, the way creeks do. May Foster knelt in the pine duff with a dead man's blood drying on her wrist, and she did not collapse, and she did not cry out, and she did not do any of the things that 3 years of grinding solitary endurance had perhaps made it impossible for her to do anymore. She simply knelt there with him for a moment, still and straight, and then she looked up at Garrett with eyes that were wet and clear and decided. "We carry him into the rocks," she said, "out of the sun, somewhere the animals cannot reach. We stack stone over him, and then we come back when this is finished and we put him in the ground properly with words said over him." Her jaw was set in the way he had come to know, meant the matter was closed. "I will not leave Pete Hardin in the open after what he gave us. I will not." So they carried him. The two of them together, the old man weighing almost nothing at the end of a long sickness. And they laid him in a deep cleft of granite where two faces of rock leaned together like hands cupped to hold something, and May covered his face with her own kerchief, and Garrett stacked stone over the opening until no animal alive could work its way down. It took 20 minutes they could not spare. Neither of them suggested stopping at 15. When the last stone was settled, May stood over the cairn and said the old words, low and plain, the ones about dust and green pastures and the valley of the shadow, and at the end of them she added, in the voice that had gone past grief and out the far cold side of it, "You are on the list now too, Pete. Not just a witness anymore, a charge, and I will read your name into the record myself when the time comes." They recovered the horses that could be recovered. One could not, and Garrett did the mercy of it quietly behind a screen of pine while May stood with her back turned and her eyes on the middle distance. And then they mounted and rode out of that place hard, north now, away from the secret road that was secret no longer, toward a hunting cabin in the timber above the north fork of the Sweetwater, and the one honest lawman left who might know what to do with a dead man's last words and a dying man's long-held truth. It was full dark when they came down through the last of the timber above the north fork and saw the cabin's single lit window burning through the trees like a coal left in a cold grate. May reined up at the tree line and studied the trail entrance for a long moment before moving. There is a stake by the trail with a board nailed crossways. If the board points up the slope, it means come ahead, the cabin is clear. If it points down, then we sit in the dark and watch until morning and hope we read the ground right, Garrett finished. Yes, she leaned forward in the saddle, and he saw her shoulders ease by a single degree. It points up. Eli is here, or someone who means us to think he is. Could be Harlan's people. Harlan's people do not know this cabin exists. My father and Eli Bennett were friends from the years before this county had enough money in it to make men careful of each other. This place was theirs. She moved her horse forward out of the trees. But you keep the rifle where it can be used quickly. Just the same, they walked the horses in slow, the bay picking its careful way through the dark, and as they came into the spill of lamplight, falling from the cabin's single window, a man rose from the porch shadows, where he had been sitting with a long gun across his knees. He stood up. He looked at them. And then he went very still, the way a person goes still when they see something they had decided they were never going to see again. Maybelle Foster. Eli Bennett's voice came out rough, abraded by some feeling he was not entirely managing to keep back behind his teeth. Lord above, child, I had given you up. 3 years as I have been. He came down off the porch and crossed to her horse, and when she swung down stiff and swaying from the mott, he steadied her with both hands and looked at her face in the lamplight, and then looked down at the dark stain dried on her wrist. And his expression changed into something harder and more careful. Whose blood is that? Tell me it is not yours, Pete Hardin's. She stood to her full height in the light, deliberately, the way a flag gets run back up after a storm. He is dead, Eli. They killed him in the rocks below the North Ridge this afternoon. Harlan and 5 others laid in wait on the secret road. He died telling me where the rope is, and I have ridden all day to put it in your hands. Bennett's eyes moved to Garrett, doing the lawman's instinctive inventory, the rifle and the way it was carried, and the particular stillness that settled into a man who had recently used one. And you, Garrett Dalton. I bought at the Foster Ranch 2 mornings ago for $1. Garrett stepped down. I have spent the time since learning in considerable detail what the dollar actually bought. Something shifted in the old sheriff's face. Dalton, you ride with the cavalry out of Fetterman in the late 70s? 2 years. Then I was done with it. I thought so. It settles into a man's way of standing and never quite leaves. Bennett's jaw worked once. I rode too, back before this county had a name worth the ink. And I will tell you the thing I told myself, the morning I pinned a star to my coat. In a county the Maddox brothers believe they own outright. A man either stands for the law when standing has a cost to it, or he was never standing for the law at all. He was standing for his own quiet life and calling it the law because that sounded better. He turned toward the cabin door. Get inside, both of you. Off the trail and out of the night air. There is coffee on and there is clean cloth for that wrist, and I have been waiting 3 years to hear whatever it is you are about to tell me. Inside was one warm room, a stone hearth with a fire burning low, a plank table scarred with years of use, 2 bunks against the far wall, the close comfortable smell of wood smoke and gun oil, and old coffee going stale in the pot. May laid it all out across the table in the firelight, piece by piece, with the deliberate care of a woman who has rehearsed this moment in her head 10,000 times and is determined not to waste it now that it has finally arrived. The original deed with its territorial stamp and seal, the survey maps in her father's exact and patient hand, the journal, its cover dark and soft, and then last and most carefully Pete Hardin's final words, spoken into the dirt of a ridge, with a dying man's hand pressing a red print to her wrist, the strongbox, the false back, the right-hand drawer. The notebook Roy Maddox had been keeping for 3 years, writing down in his own vain hand every crime the Maddox brothers had committed and every official they had bought to look the other way while they committed it. Bennett listened to all of it without once interrupting. He was a good listener, had become 1 over 30 years of wearing a star in a county where the truth came out sideways, or in pieces or not at all. When May finished, he sat back in his chair and pulled a hand slowly down across his face and looked into the fire for a long time before he spoke. 3 years, he said finally. 3 years I have had a grieving daughter's word and a box of papers any lawyer out of Denver can call forgeries before his first cup of the morning. I knew it was not enough. I always knew. And I hated knowing it every single day of those 3 years. He looked up at her. A living witness, Pete, on the stand under oath. That would have been enough. But Pete is in the rocks now, and a dead man cannot swear to anything. The firelight worked across his weathered face. except for the notebook. Roy Maddox keeping his own written record of his own crimes in his own hand, locked in his own strongbox. That is not a daughter's grief, and it is not a document a lawyer can wave off as a forgery. That is a confession with 100 names attached to it like weights on a line. His eyes sharpened to a particular focus. That does not simply clear you, Maybelle. That does not just put two brothers in front of a judge. That burns the whole operation down to the ground and salts over what is left. Then we go and get it, May said, with the simplicity of a woman, stating a thing she has already fully decided. It sits in the middle of a working mine, with armed men on every approach. Bennett shook his head. You walk in there, neither of you walks back out. I have buried better armed men than us for less. Silas Maddox is riding to my ranch. May leaned forward into the firelight, and the planning hardness that Garrett had watched develop in her over 2 days of fire was fully forged now, finished, tempered into something precise. He is coming for me. He thinks I am there, and he thinks the maps are there, and he will bring his best men to make certain of the ending. Which means that while Silas is riding south to burn a house that will be empty when he gets there, the mine is the emptiest it will ever be. Garrett saw the shape of the whole thing at once. He pulls his own house apart to come knock yours down, and we are not at the ranch when he arrives. May's voice had dropped to something very quiet and very certain. We are at the mine, getting the notebook out of the strongbox, and then I am going to take it to the one place where it cannot be buried quietly or paid off in a back room. I am going to take it to Silver Creek, to the street where my father filed his claim and where this town stood on its porches, and watched 2 men from Denver take everything we had. And I am going to make Silas Maddox answer for what he did in front of every soul who was there when he did it. Bennett looked between the two of them, and Garrett watched the old lawman do the same cold accounting he himself had done on a porch 2 days ago. The odds and the ground and the cost of it weighed against the cost of the alternative. I cannot sanction it. He said that part, and then he said the rest of it, which was the part that carried the weight, officially. I cannot put the star behind 2 civilians breaking into a man's property, and I want you both to understand that plainly going in. But I can tell you that I will have 4 good deputies and a county warrant ready to ride the minute somebody lays that notebook in my hand, and I can tell you that the law moves at the pace of a lame mule, and wickedness moves considerably faster, and sometimes the only people standing in the gap between them are the ones the law is better off not knowing the details of. He pushed himself up from the table, knees cracking. Eat something, both of you. Sleep if you are able. We ride before first light, and we do whatever fool thing we are about to do better for having rested. He took his rifle and went out to take the first watch, and the door shut behind him, and the fire was left to the 2 of them. For a while neither of them filled the quiet that Bennett left behind him. The fire settled lower, throwing less light and more shadow. May had unwound the stained cloth from her wrist, and now sat turning her arm in the firelight, looking at the dark print Pete's hand had left on the skin there. Not cleaning it away, not looking away from it either. Just sitting with it the way a person sits with a thing that needs to be sat with before it can be properly carried. You killed 3 men today. She said it into the fire, not to him, a fact she was setting down on the hearthstone to look at in the light. Not an accusation, not a question, just the plain weight of it being acknowledged by someone who understood what plain weights were. 3 I am certain of. He did not look away from it either. A man who keeps a careful tally of that kind of accounting is a man getting comfortable with it. I would rather lose the count. You ran at that flanker. Now she looked at him. You did not have to. You had cover. You could have stayed behind that boulder and traded shots all afternoon and most likely lived. You left cover and ran straight at a leveled rifle so he could not get an angle on me and Pete behind the pine. Because if he got the angle he would have killed you both inside a minute and I would have been alive behind a rock watching it happen. He met her eyes. That was the arithmetic. It was not bravery, do not do that. Her voice came sharp, clean, direct. Do not make the brave thing small after the doing of it. I have watched people do that my whole life, take the honest, courageous act and sand it down to nothing, so they will not have to stand still and be looked at for it. You left cover for me. Say it plain. A beat of silence. I left cover for you, he said. And do not ask me to pretend I do not know when that stopped being the debt you were paying down and started being something else. Because I have been watching you for 2 days, Garrett Dalton. I have been watching very carefully. I had 3 years of practice watching from behind a half-drawn curtain, and I know the difference between a man doing his duty and a man doing something harder than duty. She looked back into the fire. I just wanted it named between us. Before tomorrow makes naming things complicated. The fire said nothing useful in the silence that followed. Outside, Bennett moved on the porch. One slow step and then another, and the night held its cold ground around the cabin. May, Garrett's voice came rough in his throat, unpracticed at this particular kind of honesty. When this is done, if there is a far side of it and we both reach it, he started again, the way he would start again on a board he had cut wrong and needed to rethink from the beginning. I told you on the porch that I had a wife and a daughter, and I told you how I lost them, and I told you I did not intend to be 400 miles off the next time somebody needed standing beside. And every word of that was true when I said it. He looked at his hands on his knees in the firelight. But somewhere on that road today, it stopped being true in the same way it was true on the porch. The 40 miles, the debt, the penance, all of that. It stopped being what I was doing, and what I was doing instead. He stopped again. Say it plain, she said. The same words. Gentler this time. What I was doing instead was being afraid of losing you. Not Sarah, not the past, you, Maybelle Foster, who I have known for 2 days, and who has shown me more of what a person can be made of than anyone I have met in the 6 years since I ran out of people to be made of anything for. He looked up at her. That is the plain version. The fire moved on her face, on the full round of her cheeks, and the deep shadow of the dimples, and the freckles scattered across her toes, and she looked at him for a long moment with the dark, steady eyes that had been the first thing about her he had truly seen. Men have looked at me my whole life and seen too much of something, she said slowly. Too much weight, too much trouble, too much of a thing the world would rather not accommodate. I learned early to make myself smaller on the inside to balance the books on the outside. I apologized for the room I took up before anyone had the chance to ask me to. She turned her broad hand over in her lap and looked at the red print on her wrist. And then a man I had never seen before walked through my door with $1 worth of deed and spent the rest of the day looking at me like there was exactly the right amount of me. Not too much. Not something to be managed or reduced or apologized for. Just exactly what was there. She looked up at him. I do not know what to do with that, Garrett. I have no practice at it. But I find I want the practice very badly. He reached across the small space between their chairs and put his hand palm up on the table between them. An open question, no demand in it. She looked at it for a moment, and then she put her broad warm hand into it, and he closed his fingers around hers. And they sat that way, not speaking, the fire burning lower, and the night pressing in at the walls. Two people who had each been thrown away by the world at different times in different ways, finding out what it felt like to be held on to instead. After, he said, very quietly, into the firelight. There will be an after, she said it without hesitation, with the flat certainty she brought to the things she had truly decided. I have made up my mind that there will be, and I have noticed that when I fully make up my mind about a thing lately, the world has been giving way to it. So there will be an after. And in it you are going to build me a house. She almost smiled, with glass windows, wide ones on every wall. Not because Silas Maddox has them and I want what he has, but because I have spent 3 years looking at the world through a curtain I never once dared pull all the way back, watching the trail for the riders who were going to come and kill me. I want to live, just once, in a place where I can throw every curtain wide to the morning and feel nothing in my chest when I do it. Glass windows, he looked at her in the firelight. A man builds his wife a house full of glass windows, the whole county sees it. There is no taking it back quiet. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. That is entirely the point of it. It was not a proposal, and it was not quite an answer to one. It was a window thrown open in the dark, the first of the ones she was talking about, and Garrett Dalton felt something he had believed permanently closed open alongside it, and let the cold that had lived in him for 6 years go out one quiet degree at a time, while the fire burned down and the night ran toward whatever the dawn was going to require of them. Bennett woke them an hour before first light, with a hand on each shoulder, and a single word spoken quietly into the dark of the cabin. Movement? They came up off the bunks already reaching for their guns, the way people reach for things they have been sleeping with one hand on, and followed him to the window. Below on the low trail, 2 riders moving south at a steady lope, not hurrying, not looking around, the particular unhurried pace of men who believe they own the country they are crossing. They passed through the small gap in the trees where the moonlight reached the trail and were gone. Maddox riders, Bennett said. Not after us. Heading for Silver Creek or beyond, but moving, which means Silas is moving, which means we are done waiting on a comfortable hour. He turned back to the room. And there is one more thing I would have kept until morning if I could find a way to keep it that would not be a lie. He took his hat off, and Garrett had learned in the short time he had known the man that the hat only came off for the dead. I rode down to the deadfall at the edge of the valley before dark. The place you told me Boone Carter uses for leaving word. He had left word, Maybelle. He left himself. The blood went out of May's face. They worked him over before they killed him. Bennett said it in the flat, careful voice of a man delivering news he has already grieved himself, so that he can deliver it without falling apart. I will not paint it for you in detail. It was bad and it was not quick, and it was done by men who wanted answers from him and had no particular concern for how they got them. He held the hat at his side. Near as I can read the sign, he gave them the secret road into the creek bottom. That is how Harlan was waiting for you at the ridge today. But he never gave them this cabin. He never gave them which way you would run past the creek bottom, because he did not have it to give, or he would not give it. He let them have the one road that hurt him least to lose, and he carried the rest of it down into the dark. With him, May stood in the middle of the cabin floor with her arms coming up around her own frame, slowly, as though she were holding something in that would otherwise come apart. The news went into her the way the worst kind of news goes in, not with the sharp shock of the ambush on the ridge, but with the slow, deep cold of a thing reaching all the way through. Boone Carter, her father's oldest friend, the man who had held a fortune in his own name for 3 years, so that holding it would not kill her. The man who had sold 100 acres for a single dollar to a stranger he had never met, on nothing more than the old gambler's faith, that a good man might still come riding down a Wyoming road if a person left the right door cracked open at the right time. Tortured to death at a deadfall in the timber of his own valley, and dying with the most important parts of the truth locked behind his teeth, giving up only the road that would hurt her least. He gave them the creek road to stop the pain, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet, not thin, not about to break, just very quiet, the way a thing goes quiet when it has been reduced to its essential nature. And he held the cabin, and he held me to the very end of what he could hold. Her hand moved to the small of her back, where the satchel with her father's map still rode under her coat. He paid for this with his breaking point. Same as Pete paid with his last breath. Same as my father paid with his life. She stood there a moment longer with her arms around herself in the dark cabin, and then she let her arms drop, and she straightened to her full broad height, and the quiet in her voice became something else, something that had been tempered in the last 2 days of fire and loss, and was finished now, complete, ready for whatever use it needed to be put to. 3 men have died to put me on this floor with this rope in my hands. I will not waste the rope. Garrett came and stood beside her, not touching, just there, his shoulder a hand's breadth from hers, the way you stand beside a person whose grief is too large to be carried for them, but too heavy to be stood next to without witness. Bennett put his hat back on. We ride in an hour. Before there is enough light to throw dust they can see from the south road. He began checking his rifle with the efficiency of long practice, the high cut. You said your father found a trail along the spine of the ridge above the mine, coming down behind the office from the north. Ground the Maddox crew has never worked and never watched. It is bad country, May said, worse than anything we have ridden so far. There is a section near the top where the horses cannot go at all, a sheer slab of granite tilting downhill with nothing below it but the Tately slope. We go over it on foot, leading the horses to it and bringing them across. After, if they will come and leaving them, if they will not. Can you find it in the dark? She looked at him with the flat, steady eyes of a woman who has been asked one too many questions about whether she is capable of the thing she has just said she will do. My father took me up that cut when I was 12 years old and told me to memorize it, because someday I would need a road the wolves did not know about. I memorized it. I have walked it in my sleep for 3 years. She turned to pick up her coat from the bunk. I will find it. So they rode out into the last of the dark, 3 riders and 1 nervous borrowed horse, with the stars going pale overhead and the cold of the high country coming down off the ridges in long, slow waves. May took the lead without ceremony, and they followed her lines exactly, because her line was the only one that mattered this morning. The high cut began gently enough, a deer trail winding up through the lower pine timber, with the ground still soft underfoot, and the horses willing. Then the trees thinned and the ground tilted hard, and the trail narrowed to a thing that required all of a rider's attention and most of their nerve. May moved through it without hesitating, where the trail bent around a granite shoulder, and the outside edge dropped away into nothing. She took the inside line with a calm precision that the horses felt through the reins and believed. Where the footing went to loose shale above a long slope, she dismounted, without being told, and walked her horse across on the uphill side, talking to it in the low, steady voice she had learned from a father, who understood that a frightened animal needs to hear certainty before it can find its own. She read the ground 3 moves ahead, the way her father had taught her to read a stream, not looking at where her feet were, but at where they were going to be, and the difficult country gave way to her. The way difficult country gives way to people who have learned to read it honestly instead of fighting it. Garrett rode behind her and watched, and the watching undid something in him that the talking had not quite reached, because this was the thing nobody saw. Not the woman who stood on the porch with the gun, or the woman who knelt in the dirt over Pete Hardin, or the woman who sat by the fire and said things plain that most people spent their whole lives refusing to say. This, a large woman on a narrow trail in the dark, moving through the hardest ground with the unhurried sureness of someone who had spent 24 years learning exactly how to carry herself through a world that kept building its doors and her. Not in spite of her size, but with it, using every pound of the stability it gave her. Her weight a thing she had made her own, and put to use on the ground that required it. He thought about what Henry Foster had written in the last pages of the journal, that she did not yet know the full size of what she was capable of. Henry had been wrong about that, Garrett thought. She knew, she had known for a long time. She had simply been waiting for a piece of ground hard enough to prove it on. The slab came near the top of the cut, where the trail ran out altogether, and left nothing but a span of bare granite tilting downhill at an angle that made the stomach drop to look at, with the talus slope falling away below it for 100 feet before it reached anything a person could call ground. Not wide enough to be called a cliff, wide enough to matter. Bennett looked at it and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Horses to the edge, then across on foot, one at a time, May said. She was already down, running her hand along her horse's neck, reading the animal's nerves through her palm. I go first, then Eli. Then Garrett brings the horses if they will come. She looked at Bennett's bound shoulder, the arm he had been carrying carefully since they left the cabin. Your shoulder. Tell me honestly. My shoulder will get me across that rock, or it will get me into the next world trying. And either way I am crossing it. The old man's voice was flat with finality. Do not fuss me, Maybelle. She went across first, flat to the slab, both hands reading the stone, her broad body close to the surface, using her weight as an anchor against the tilt instead of fighting it. Halfway across she found a small lip of raised granite, barely an inch, and she used it for her uphill foot, and moved the rest of the way with a deliberateness that made Garrett realize she had not just memorized the trail. She had memorized this specific slab, this specific lip, this specific line across it, carrying the information in her body for 12 years against the day she would need it. She made the far edge and turned and reached her hand back across the gap. Bennett went next, one-armed and gray-faced, not looking down, cursing steadily under his breath, in a voice too low to make out the specific words. He got 3/4 of the way across, and his boot slipped on a patch of rime frost in the shadow, and May had him by the coat before he had fully registered the slipping, her grip absolute, and she walked him the rest of the way to solid ground, as though the slab and the talus below it were simply not relevant information. Garrett brought the horses. One came, nervous but trusting, and he talked it across the way he had heard May talk hers, low and certain, and it believed him. The second would not come for anything he tried, and he left it picketed on the safe side and told himself it was a problem for the return trip, and crossed the slab in 4 fast steps without looking at anything below the line of the far edge. May's hand was there when he reached it, the same as it had been for Bennett. Your father taught you this crossing too, Garrett said. He taught me every hard thing on this mountain. She did not let go of his hand for a moment after his boots found solid ground. The easy things I learned on my own. The hard ones were his. They came down off the spine through the last of the dark, through a 1/4 mile of broken rock that had to be crossed partly on hands and knees, until the high timber closed over them and the ground leveled, and through the last screen of pine they saw the mine, laid out below in the gray light of the coming dawn, raw and ugly as a wound that would not close. The head frame black against the sky, the long low office building set apart from the bunkhouses, a handful of lamps burning in the early shift, and set on a flat shelf of ground near the office, Apart from all the working ugliness of the mine itself, a house with real glass windows, burning warm and gold from within. Silas Maddox's house, built on a murdered man's gold. Warm behind glass that Henry Foster had never lived to see. May looked at it without speaking. Garrett did not crowd the silence. He knew what a person looked like when they were finally seeing the place all their grief had poured out of, and he knew there were no words worth putting into that. "He sleeps in there," she said at last. "Flat, almost wondering, on my father's gold. Behind glass windows with a fire in the hearth, warm as a church on Christmas morning, while Pete Hardin is under stones I stacked with my own hands yesterday afternoon, and Boone Carter is lying at a deadfall in the timber." She drew a long breath and let it out slow. "And this morning that house empties out and rides south to burn what is left of my family off the face of the earth. And we will be down there in the dark behind it, lifting the one thing out of his brother's strongbox that brings the whole weight of it crashing down on his head." Her jaw settled into its finished line. "I have waited 3 years. One more morning is nothing, now that I can see the end of it." They laid up in the timber above the mine and watched the dark give way to gray, and the gray give way to the thin, cold light of early morning. And Bennett posted himself where he could see both the trail behind them and the mine below, and May and Garrett sat with their backs to the same fallen log, and the one blanket May had rolled behind her saddle spread across both their laps against the high cold. The stars were still out, the last of them, burning hard against the pale edge of the east. "Tell me about Lily." May said it into the dark between them, soft, carefully placed, an offering made with both hands open. Garrett's chest closed on the name. 6 years and nobody had asked him that. They asked how. They asked when. They asked where was he when it happened, which was always the question that cost the most to answer. Not one person in 6 years had asked him who. She was 3 years old. His voice came out of him at an unfamiliar register, rough and low, cleared from somewhere it had been stored a long time. She had her mother's dark hair. She had my temper, which Sarah always said was the most unfair arrangement God ever made in a single child, and I was not in any position to argue. He stopped. The fire of the mine's night shift burned below them in the dark, orange and small at this distance. She was not afraid of anything in this world. That was the part I could not carry after. My girl had not one afraid bone in her little body, and it did not save her, and I was not there to be afraid on her behalf, because being afraid for the people you love is half the whole job of it. He turned his hands over on his knees. "I thought the job was the wage. 400 miles for the soldier's pay. That is a man doing his duty by his family. I came home and stood in front of 2 small graves and learned the actual job in about 30 seconds. The job is being there. That is the whole of it. Being the body between your people and whatever is coming. The wage is beside the point." May's broad, warm hand found his in the dark under the blanket and folded around it. The same hand that had held a dying old man's. The same hand that had steadied a shotgun on a porch and stacked stones over a cairn without resting, and he felt the warmth of it go all the way up his arm. "You are here now," she said. "The thing is coming at dawn and you are here. You cannot ride back and undo the 400 miles, Garrett. No one can hand you that, but you are the man who stays now. You have been being him since you walked through my door and did not leave when the sensible thing was leaving. You do not owe the dead another grave. You have been paying them in the only coin that was ever worth a thing, which is staying." He turned his hand over and held hers. And they sat that way under the burning, last stars, 2 people each taught the arithmetic of love by saluting it, sitting, with their shoulders touching in the cold above an enemy's house, learning something harder than arithmetic. "After," he said into the dark, "there will be an after, no hesitation. The flat certainty of a fully made decision. I have decided there will be. And I have noticed lately that when I decide a thing fully, the world has been giving way to it." Her thumb moved once across the back of his hand. "And in the after, are going to build me that house, with the glass windows. And I am going to stand in it in the morning, with every curtain thrown wide. And I am going to feel nothing in my chest but the light coming in." A small sound that was almost a laugh. "I have spent 3 years looking at the world through a gap in a curtain I never once dared pull back all the way. I am very tired of the gap, glass windows," he said. "A man builds his wife a house like that. The whole county sees it and knows it, and there is no taking it back quiet. It is a promise made in glass, I know." Her voice had gone low and warm and sure. "That is exactly what I want it to be. A promise made in glass in the full light, where everyone can see it, and not one of them can come along later and say it was never made." It was not a proposal, and she had not answered one. It was a window thrown open between them in the dark, the first of the many she was talking about, and Garrett let it stand open and felt the cold that had lived in him for 6 years go out through it, one quiet degree at a time. While the stars went out above the Wyoming ridgeline and the east turned from black to the deep blue of the last hour before sunrise. Bennett came off his watch a little before first light with his boot scraping the stone. Once in the signal they had agreed on, and the three of them gathered at the tree line above the mine and looked down at the house with the glass windows and waited. Silas Maddox came out of the house with the dawn. He came out dressed in his dark coat, unhurried, the way a man moves through a morning he has no reason to believe will be different from any other. He crossed to the corral, and after him came Roy, and after Roy came Wade Harlan with his scar pale in the early light, and after Harlan came the riders, one and then another, saddling up in the gray morning with the efficiency of men who had done this kind of riding before. They counted them. 9, 10, 11. Silas on the gray horse at the front of the column. Roy at his shoulder. Every man Garrett had seen at the mine the night before, and then some, 11 riders emptying out of the mine to ride south to a ranch that would be empty when they got there. He is taking everything he has, May said very quietly. He wants to be certain of the ending. Bennett's voice was barely above the sound of the wind in the pines. He has been waiting 3 years for this. He will not do it by halves. The gate opened. The column moved out, south, Silas at its head on the gray horse, sitting straight as a man who owns the ground he rides over, which he believed he did, which he was going to spend the rest of this day, discovering was not true. The horses moved from walk to trot to canter, and the dust rose behind them gold in the early light, and the sound of the hooves carried up through the thin morning air to the three people watching from the timber until it faded out and was gone. Below, the mine went quiet. Skeleton of men remaining, 2 at the stamp mill by the sound of it, a guard's lamp moving slow along the front of the bunkhouse. No purpose to it, no urgency. The window had opened. On foot from the timberline, May said. She was already moving, shedding the heavy coat, rolling her sleeves, becoming the version of herself that moved fast and quiet, down through the cleared rock to the back of the office. Quiet as we can. Eli, you hold the yard. You whistle if anything moves that should not. 1 whistle means slow down. 2 means come out running. Understood. Bennett checked his pistol and took his position at the tree line, his back to a pine, his eyes on the yard below. Go, and God keep you both. They went down through the cleared rock in the growing light, 2 shadows moving toward the back of the office, where a strong box sat behind a false back and a right-hand drawer, waiting to give up the last 3 years of wickedness in a single breath. The way all held things give up at last, when the right hands finally find them in the dark. The back of the mine office was raw pine plank, gone silver with weather, a single shuttered window, and a door without a lock because no one had ever imagined needing one this far inside Maddox ground. May reached it first. She had outrun Garrett down the last of the cleared slope, and he was not a slow man. She moved through the open ground the way she had moved through the hard country on the high cut, using everything she had and wasting nothing. All that weight and breadth of her turned to a single forward purpose. And she arrived at the back wall, with her broad back flat against the planking, and the shotgun across her chest, and her eyes hard on the near corner of the building, before Garrett had covered the last 20 feet. He came up beside her and caught his breath. She was already reading the sounds from inside and around the building, her head tilted, her eyes distant with the focus of pure listening. 1 guard, she breathed, shaping the words with almost no air behind them. Front porch, chair tipped back against the wall by the sound of it. Asleep or near enough to it. Pete said 2. Pete said 2. Her jaw tightened in the early light. I hear 1. I do not like it. But I am not leaving without the book over 1 I cannot locate, which was the trouble with a dying man's count. He had watched Roy Maddox work, that strongbox from across a room for 3 years. He had never himself stood behind the office in the dark, trying to remember whether there were 1 guards or 2. You could not send back down into the rocks, to the cairn, and ask him to reconsider the number. Bennett came up last between them, moving with the careful economy of a man managing a hurt shoulder and not letting it manage him, and pressed 1 hand flat against his own ribs to quiet his breathing. He jerked his chin at the door, then pointed at himself and at the yard beyond the corner of the building. Inside, both of you, he mouthed. I hold the yard. Whistle means trouble. 1 whistle, slow down. 2 whistles, you come out whatever way you can and keep running. May lifted the latch. The door swung inward on a low groan that in the silence of the early mine morning sounded to Garrett like a shout, and they went in fast and pulled it nearly shut behind them. Inside was the dim gray light of a shuttered room, and the accumulated smell of it, cold coffee and dead cigars and the close stale air of a place where men sat for long hours, doing things they preferred not to do in the open. A desk under the shuttered window, a wall of pigeonholes jammed with curling paper, a pot-belly stove gone cold since yesterday, and there against the far wall, squat and black and bound around with iron in the way of things a man wants to keep and does not trust anyone else with, the strongbox. May was already across the room to it, her hand on the lid. Then her hand went still. Not a box of drawers. A sealed chest, the lid fitted close and locked with a heavy iron hasp, and the lock was a good one, a big cylinder lock with a key that was not here and was presumably on a chain around Roy Maddox's person 40 miles south and riding hard. He watched the plan she had built and carried collapse against the cold iron fact of a lock with no key. He said drawer. The first thin thread of something close to panic that he had ever heard from her came into her voice. Garrett, he said the right-hand drawer. He said false back, he said. He was dying. Garrett was already on his knees beside the chest, both palms flat against it, reading it the way he read timber before he cut, with his hands as much as his eyes. He watched Roy work this thing 100 times from across a room over 3 years. He never once locked or unlocked it himself. The drawer is inside, behind the false back, inside the chest, exactly where Pete said it was. We open the chest and we find the drawer. His fingers moved over the hasp plate, over the screws that held it to the wood of the lid. Pine. He pressed the wood beside the nearest screw and it gave slightly, the soft give of cheap lumber under a thumbnail. There, he bought a good lock and set it into poor wood, because a man who is proud of his cleverness is always cheap in the one place he thinks will not show. The lock is iron. What it is screwed into is butter, can you? Quietly. Not with the rifle butt. He had the knife out already. Give me the time and pray that God stays in his chair. He went to work on the screws of the hasp plate one at a time, backing each one out of the soft pine by hand, his whole body curved over the chest to muffle the small sounds of the working. The sweat came up on him in the cold room despite the cold, because the sounds seemed enormous in the silence, and the guard's chair on the front porch, and the second guard whose location remained unknown, were both on the other side of walls that were made of the same cheap pine as the hasp plate. May stood over him with the shotgun on the door and her breathing held as close to nothing as breathing can be held. Outside, the mine went about its early morning business, the distant rhythmic crushing of the stamp mill, a horse moving in the corral, the low exchange of two voices from the direction of the bunkhouse, the entirely ordinary sounds of a place that had no idea its whole stolen foundation was being quietly unscrewed from the inside. The first screw turned out clean. The second, the third caught on stripped threads and would not back out properly, and Garrett had to work the knife point around its edge and lever it bodily free of the wood, and the small, sharp crack of it releasing froze them both for 3 long heartbeats. On the porch the chair scraped against the boards, settled. The slow snoring resumed, the fourth screw came. The hasp plate swung loose on its lock. Useless now, the good iron defeated not by force but by the wood that had trusted it. Garrett lifted the lid. Ledgers stacked in neat rows. 2 cash boxes. A pearl-handled revolver laid on a square of oiled cloth, the kind of gun a vain man buys to be seen wearing rather than to use, and set into the very bottom of the chest, fitted so flush with the floor of it that you would never find the seam, unless you knew exactly where to press your thumbnail, a shallow panel. Garrett found the edge and pried, and the false back lifted, and behind it sat the right-hand drawer exactly as a dying man had sworn with his last clear breath it would. He slid it open, a leather notebook, fat, dark, soft with the grease of a hand that had opened it 1,000 times. A leather cord wound twice around it to keep it closed. May took it up in both her broad hands the way you take up something you have been moving toward for 3 years. Without knowing it had a specific shape and weight and smell. She unwound the cord, opened the cover, and in the thin light coming through the shutter slats she bent close and read the first page. And Garrett watched her face change, not to triumph, not yet, but to the particular expression of a person holding their own truth confirmed in an enemy's hand, the look of 3 years of being told you invented the wrong, and finding the wrong written out in the wrongdoer's own careful script. It is all here. Her voice had gone down to almost nothing. Listen. Paid coil 400, foster claim, will not hear appeals. That is the territorial judge, Garrett, the man who was supposed to hear my case. Senator's man, Capital 2000, silence on the inquest. H. Foster, handled, mine, do not commit to paper. A sound came out of her that was half a laugh and entirely without humor. He wrote do not commit to paper, and then he committed it to paper because he could not help himself. He had to count up his own cleverness somewhere. He had to keep the record. She pressed the notebook flat against her chest. Pete, you were right about every word of it. May. Garrett was already easing the chest lid back toward closed, already moving in his mind past the room to the door and the yard and the long ride that had to come next. You can read every page of it into a court record until your voice gives out. But that is tomorrow's work. We only reach tomorrow if we walk out of this room in the next 2 minutes. She tucked the notebook inside her shirt, against her skin, and turned for the door. That was when the whistle came from the yard. Sharp, single, the sound cutting through the thin walls of the office like a blade. Then a voice, young, raised in sudden alarm, coming from the far side of the building, where neither of them had placed a guard, because neither of them had known he was there. Coming back from the outhouse or the end of a perimeter walk, arriving at a cracked back door that should have been closed, putting together in the space of 2 seconds what 2 cracked doors and a missing hasp plate meant. Hey, somebody is in the office. Guard up. The front door of the office banged open, and a man filled it with a rifle coming up to his shoulder, and Garrett shot him before the barrel found level, and the man went down across the threshold. But the shot was its own alarm on top of the shouted one. A bell rung across the whole mine, and from the bunkhouse came the sounds of men waking with a specific and violent purpose. Go, Garrett said. Front, not the back. Bennett is at the front, because you do not go out the quiet door and leave the man who whistled alone in the loud yard. That is not a thing you do. May went through the door first. He would carry the image of it. She went first, broad and straight, and without a single degree of hesitation, the shotgun roaring once to clear the immediate porch. And Garrett came through behind her, covering the flanks, and Bennett fell in between them, firing his pistol one-handed, the 3 of them moving across the open yard toward the timber, with the skeleton crew Maddox had left behind pouring out of the bunkhouse behind them. A bullet found Bennett. Garrett heard the sound of it, the flat, wet impact that a bullet makes when it finds a body, and the old sheriff stumbled and went down on one knee in the dirt of the yard and came back up again, with his face gone the color of old ash, the wounded arm now hanging without use, the other hand still working the pistol with the grim mechanical purpose of a man who has decided he is not finished yet. Go! Bennett's voice came out of him, stripped to iron, all the rest of it burned away by the pain. I am hit and not dead, and you get that book clear of this yard. That is the whole game now. The book above everything. It has to reach daylight even if not one of the 3 of us does. We do not leave people. May had stopped dead in the open yard, turned back, started for the old man, and Garrett's heart went up into his throat because she was standing still in the middle of a yard, with guns converging on it from 3 directions. Get your arm over my shoulders, Eli. Right now. Get up. And she got her great strong shoulder under his good arm, and she took his weight, all of it, and moved him forward. His boots found the ground again, and his legs remembered their job, and she kept him moving with the shotgun swinging empty in her other hand, and Garrett turned and planted himself between them and the bunkhouse, and made himself the wall, the rifle steady and deliberate, dropping the first man, who came out of the bunkhouse at a run and buying with coldage accuracy the seconds that May's strength was spending getting a wounded sheriff across open ground. They made the timber. They made the horses. Garrett threw Bennett up and lashed him to the saddle with his own belt, because the old man's good hand would not hold a horn reliably at speed, and Bennett cursed him for it in a voice gone ragged at the edges, but did not argue the doing of it, and then they went back up the spine the way they had come down, fast and reckless on ground that had demanded care going down, the horses scrambling on the granite while shots cracked off the rock below them and sang away into the open sky, until the curve of the ridge put solid stone between them, and the guns and the firing fell away behind, and there was nothing left in the whole wide morning but the heave of the horses and the sound of Bennett's breathing, and the cold high silence of the ridge. They did not stop until the mine was a full hour behind them, and Bennett had gone the color of candle tallow, and was swaying in the saddle, with nothing but the belt holding him upright. They got him down in a stand of pine, where a thread of creek ran cold and clear over flat rock, and May went to work on the wound without hesitation, tearing his shirt back from the shoulder with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that hesitation in this particular business cost more than it saved. The ball had gone in high on the shoulder and come out the back, clean, no lead left behind to fester, and the bleeding was heavy but slowing. She packed the wound front and back with moss. She pulled from the creek stones, pressing hard, holding the pressure with both hands, until the seeping slowed to something manageable, and then she bound it with strips torn from her own petticoat, wrapping tight and neat, her broad fingers working the knots with the same certainty they brought to everything they touched. You will live. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the flat, assessing eye of a woman delivering a verdict. You hear me, Eli Bennett. You are not dying in a pine grove above the Sweetwater with the work half finished. I will not permit it, I believe you. The old man got the words out between his teeth. I believe you would drag me back from the actual grave by the collar if you had decided I was not done yet. He looked down at the bandaging. That is good work, Maybelle. My father had no doctor within a day's ride for most of my childhood. I learned. She stood and wiped her hands on what was left of her skirt. Can you ride? I can ride, or I can admit I cannot ride. And I have never in my life admitted I cannot ride. So the question answers itself. Garrett had been watching the back trail during the bandaging, the rifle across his knees, his eyes on the ridgeline above. Nothing had followed them over the spine. Harlan's remaining men had not given chase, which meant one of two things. Either they were too few and too shaken to follow 3 people up hard ground with guns, or they had sent a rider south to Silas instead of pursuing, which was a more dangerous outcome by a considerable distance. They will send word to Silas, he said, when May came to stand beside him. However far south he has ridden by now, he will get word that the notebook is gone and 3 people took it, and his first thought will be Sweetwater. The courthouse, the sheriff's office, the territorial judge. He will put men on every road between here and Sweetwater before the morning is out, yes. May looked south, toward the invisible line where the mine lay behind the ridge, and Silver Creek lay further still. The town she had walked out of 3 years ago with one dress and nowhere to put her next step. Which is why we are not going to Sweetwater. Garrett waited. We are going to Silver Creek, she said it, the way she said the things she had fully decided. Without decoration, the plain fact set down on the ground between them. To the main street, to the open ground in front of the church, where my father used to buy supplies on Saturday mornings, and where the whole town came out to watch 2 men from Denver take everything we owned over his fresh grave. She turned to look at him. I have spent 3 years believing that justice was a thing that happened in courtrooms behind closed doors, where a man like Silas Maddox could buy the door and the room and the man standing in front of it. I was wrong about the shape of it. The shape I want is a street. A public street, in the full light of the morning, in front of every soul who was there when the lie was told, where Silas Maddox has to answer for what he did in the open, with the whole town watching, and not one of the people who watched the first time gets the comfort of looking away from the second. Garrett looked at her. Then he looked at Bennett. The old sheriff was studying May, with an expression that had started as the careful evaluation of a lawman hearing a plan, and was becoming something else. Something closer to the look a man gets when he sees a thing done exactly right. It is the last place he will put his guns, Bennett said slowly. He will cover the roads to Sweetwater and the roads to the county seat and the roads to every courthouse he knows about. He will not cover the road to a town he already believes he owns. He has owned it for 3 years, May said. He has no reason to think that has changed. Has it changed? Garrett asked, not doubting, wanting to know what she believed. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he heard something he had not heard in her before, not the hard certainty of the fully decided thing, and not the careful guardedness of 3 years as alone, but something between them, something new, the sound of a person choosing to believe a thing they cannot yet prove. I think a town is not the same as the men who own it, she said at last. I think the people of Silver Creek believed what the Maddox brothers told them, because they had no reason to doubt it, and every reason to be afraid of the men telling it. I think that is a different thing from choosing evil. I think people who chose it by default can unchoose it the same way, when they are given something true to stand on instead. She looked down at the notebook pressing against her shirt from the inside. And I think when they hear what is in this book read aloud in the middle of their own street, they will have something true to stand on. What they do with it is their business, but I am going to give them the chance. My father would have given them the chance. It was the longest speech he had heard from her that was not about survival or tactics, or the hard practical business of staying alive. And it landed in the morning air differently than those had. with the specific weight of a person saying out loud the thing they have decided to be. "Silver Creek," Garrett said. "Silver Creek," Bennett agreed. They helped the old sheriff back onto his horse, and Garrett retied the belt to keep him square in the saddle, and May rode up alongside Bennett on his wounded side, so that if the horse stumbled or the road turned rough, she was there. And they rode south in the climbing morning, 3 people and the contents of a stolen strongbox, toward a town that had not seen Maybelle Foster in 3 years, and had no idea she was coming back to it with the truth of what it had allowed in a dead man's notebook pressed against her heart. The ride south was long, and the hours in it were hard ones. Bennett faded in and out of full alertness, the blood loss and the pain working on him despite his refusal to acknowledge either. And in the hours when he was most diminished, he talked, the way the hurt and the tired talk, without the usual editorial control, saying things he would perhaps have chosen differently in a more defended moment. He talked about Henry Foster. About the years before the Maddox brothers came, when Henry was simply a prospector with a daughter and a claim, and a habit of leaving his door open to anyone who needed a meal or a dry place to wait out a storm. About the Saturday mornings when half the county seemed to find its way to whatever stretch of ground Henry happened to be working, not because they needed anything from him, but because being near Henry Foster made the day feel like a better organized enterprise than it usually was. He had a quality, Bennett said at one point, riding with his eyes half closed and his voice coming from somewhere past the pain. Some men walk into a room and make it smaller. Henry walked in and made it bigger. Every room he was ever in had more air in it after he arrived than it had before. A silence. When they killed him and told the town he had died, owing money, the town believed it because men like the Maddox brothers understand that the easiest lie to tell is one that makes a good man smaller. Make him small enough, and the grief for him becomes manageable. Small enough and nobody feels they owe him anything. They killed him twice, once with the timbers and once with the story they told about him after. May rode beside him and listened to this without speaking, and Garrett watched her profile against the moving country and saw her take each word in and add it to the weight she was. Not being crushed by it but using it, the way her father had used, the weight of the rock above him, to tell him where the gold ran. They came down out of the hills above Silver Creek in the mid-morning, and the town lay below them in the flat light, small and plain and ordinary in the way that all places look ordinary from a distance before you understand what happened in them. May reined up on the rise and looked down at it for a long time. 3 years, she said. 3 years I dreamed of this moment, and in every single dream I had made myself thin, a short dry sound that was not quite a laugh, slender as a willow in every dream, as though I had to come back as someone the world would find it easier to look at before I could be allowed to come back at all. Even in my own dreams of my own victory, I was shrinking myself to deserve it. She straightened in the saddle, all her broad, solid self set against the sky above the town, the notebook against her heart and her father's maps at her back, and the long weight of 3 years of surviving behind her, and something else, something newer and less heavy, taking its place. Well, here is the woman who is actually riding down there this morning. Every pound of her. And she is not going to reduce herself by 1 single ounce for anything that town has to say about the packaging. Garrett said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be better than what she had just said. After this is finished, she said, still looking at the town below, and there is an after, I want you to know something. She did not look at him. I want you to know that I rode up the high cut in the dark, and I stacked stones over Pete Harden, and I walked through a yard full of guns, and I am about to ride into that town and say a thing that will either set everything right or get us all killed. And I did all of it as the woman I actually am, not the woman I used to think I had to become to be worth doing it. She paused. My father told me to memorize the hard roads because someday I would need them. I needed every one of them to get here, including the one that came through your door. Garrett looked at her on the rise above Silver Creek. The town her father had loved and that had thrown her out, the town she was riding back into, with his murderer's confessions pressed against her chest, and he thought about Henry Foster, sitting on a powder keg in an east-facing drift, with the discovery of a lifetime in the rock around him, and thinking of his daughter's face before he thought of anything else. He understood that completely now. He would have done the same. Let's go home, he said. And they rode down into Silver Creek. The town woke to them the way small towns wake to the impossible, which is to say slowly at first, and then, all at once. and with the particular intensity of people who have been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting. A shutter opened on the upper floor of the general store. A face appeared in it, and the face disappeared, and the word began moving through Silver Creek, the way word moves in a place where everyone has known everyone since before they could walk, silent and total, and faster than any horse. By the time the three riders reached the head of the main street, there were already people on the boardwalks and in the doorways, drawn out by the one sight none of them had ever expected to see in this life or any other. Maybelle Foster, riding back down out of the hills with a shot-through sheriff lashed upright in his saddle, and a hard-faced stranger at her flank, 3 years gone and given up for dead or fled, or simply and conveniently forgotten, riding back into Silver Creek, in the full morning light, as though she had every right to the road, which she did, which she had always had, which was the thing the town was, only now beginning to understand it had taken from her. May rode to the center of the street without hesitating. To the open ground before the church where her father had bought flour and nails on Saturday mornings for 20 years, where the whole town had gathered to watch two men from Denver lay claim to everything he had left behind over his fresh grave, where a girl of 21 had stood with one dress to her name, and heard herself called the daughter of a debtor and a fraud, and had walked out of it alone into 3 years of surviving. She stopped her horse in the middle of that ground, and she did not dismount. She sat her horse in the morning light, large and still and entirely present, and she let them look. Mrs. Hopkins came out of the store with flour to the wrist and her hand going up to her mouth. The minister Pike came down the church steps and stopped halfway, as though he had walked into a wall made of his own memory. Children looked out from behind their mothers' skirts, with the frank, unguarded stare of children who have not yet learned that staring is rude, and have therefore not yet learned that some things deserve to be stared at. Old men set down their pipes. The whole town gathered itself around the woman on the horse in a loose half-circle, not quite a crowd yet, a collection of individual consciences, standing close enough together to feel each other's discomfort. May looked at them all, slowly, the way a person looks at something they have had a long time to think about. "You know me." Her voice went down the length of the street clean and level, pitched to reach the last person in the last doorway, filling the morning air the way her father's voice had once filled every room he entered. "Most every one of you has known me since I was a child getting underfoot in that store. You knew my father better than you knew me. Henry Foster set the broken bones of half the children standing in this street and never once sent a bill to a man who could not pay. He lent money out of his own pocket to 3 families in this town during the bad winter of '79, and he told all 3 of them to forget it when the spring came up short. He was the best of everything this town ever produced, and this town stood on these same boardwalks and let 2 men from Denver call him a thief over his own fresh grave." Her voice did not waver and did not rise. It simply continued, with the flat, unstoppable quality of water moving downhill, and then it watched those same 2 men throw his daughter out of that road with one dress to her name and no direction to walk in. And not one of you said a single word. The silence that came down then was the particular silence of a group of people hearing a true thing, said plainly in public for the first time. Even the children had gone still in it. A dog somewhere behind the store stopped barking and did not start again. The morning held its breath. "I did not ride 3 years and bury 3 good men to come back here for your sorry." She let that land and let it sit, and let the full weight of it settle into the dirt of the street. "Sorry is cheap, and I have no more use for cheap things. I came back for the truth, and I brought it home with me, written in the hand of the man who ordered my father's murder." She drew the notebook from inside her shirt and held it up over her head where every eye in the street could find it. This small, worn leather thing that weighed as much as everything. And every last one of you is going to stand right where you are and hear it read, because you helped bury it once with your silence, and you do not get the comfort of looking away from it a second time. A sound moved through the crowd then. Not quite a murmur, and not quite a gasp. The sound a group of people makes when something shifts underneath them all at once, and they feel it before they understand it. And that was when the dust rose on the South Road. A column of riders, coming hard and fast, the drum of hooves reaching the street a full breath before the shapes did. 8, 9, 10 men in a tight column with the particular forward lean of men who are riding with a purpose, and have been riding that way for hours. At the head of them, on the tall gray horse he had ridden out of the mine that morning, a man in a long dark coat, sitting straight and unhurried as a judge arriving at his own court, Silas Maddox. He had not burned the ranch. He had found it empty and turned around, because a man with 11 riders and a dead certain belief in his own ownership of a county does not need to burn an empty house. He had what he needed right here. His rider had reached him on the south road and told him about the office and the open strongbox and the 3 people who had taken what was in it. And Silas Maddox had turned his column around and ridden straight for the one place in the territory he was most certain belonged to him. The riders fanned out at the foot of the street in the practiced way of men who had done this kind of arriving before, spreading wide, covering the exits, filling the spaces between the buildings with horses and the implicit threat of horses. The townsfolk pressed back toward the boardwalks and the doorways, opening the ground between themselves and the woman on the horse in the middle of the street. Children were pulled close and held. Silas walked the gray horse forward through the parting crowd, slow and deliberate, until he had drawn rein 20 feet from May Foster, and there he stopped, and he looked at her with the smooth, patient face of a man who has never, once in his life, doubted that the outcome of any situation would eventually arrange itself up to his satisfaction. Miss Foster, his voice was the voice of a man who had learned long ago that the most frightening thing you can offer another person is perfect calm. I had heard you had grown. The reports were not exaggerated. His eyes moved over her, taking inventory, and there was nothing in them that looked at a person. You have led my people quite a chase, killed several of them along the way. That is a serious matter. That is a matter for the law. Then let us have the law. May did not shift in the saddle, did not flinch, did not lean back, did not reduce herself by the fraction of an inch he was counting on her to reduce herself by. She met his smooth, dead eyes across the 20 feet of dirt between them as an equal, as more than an equal, as a woman who had buried the people his money had killed, and come back carrying the proof of it. Sheriff Bennett is right here beside me, wounded in the shoulder by one of your men at your own mine this morning. He has a county warrant coming behind him with 4 deputies to serve it. And I have this. She raised the notebook again, the same gesture she had made for the town, but aimed now directly at the man who had written it. Your brother Roy's own ledger, in your brother Roy's own hand. Every judge you have purchased, every official whose silence you have rented. The Denver bank where the money you stole from my father's mine sits drawing interest. And the murder, she let the word land alone in the space between them, written in your brother's hand. The murder of Henry Foster, dated, detailed, Roy's own accounting of the thing. He could not stop himself from counting. For the first time, something moved in the smooth face. Something very small, very controlled, very quickly suppressed. But the street saw it, Garrett saw it, and Roy Maddox, sitting his horse at his brother's right shoulder, saw it too. And what Roy felt was not the controlled flicker of a man who manages his reactions. What Roy felt cracked straight across his face like a fault line opening. She is lying. Roy's voice came out high and stripped of the smoothness his brother had spent a lifetime teaching him. There is no book. You do not have anything. You cannot have. It is against my heart, Roy. May's voice came almost gentle, almost kind, and the kindness of it was the most devastating thing in the street. Right here, where I have been carrying it since you're mine. The page where you wrote, do not commit to paper, and then wrote every word of it down anyway. Because you have never in your life been able to resist keeping the score. She tilted her head by a degree. Shall I read that page first? Or would you prefer I begin with Judge Coyle's $400? Roy Maddox drew his gun. It happened in a single compressed moment that Garrett's body understood before his mind did. The way bodies understand the things they have been trained for, and he was already moving before the gun cleared Roy's holster. He came off his horse on the left side and put the horse between himself and Roy's line of fire in the same motion, and he came up with the rifle from behind the horse's neck, and he shot Roy Maddox through the right shoulder before Roy's pistol had fully leveled, and Roy's shot went into the dirt of Silver Creek's main street 6 feet wide of anyone it might have killed. Roy went sideways in the saddle and caught himself, and stayed mounted, which was more than Garrett had expected of him, and then the whole careful standoff detonated at once. Maddox men reaching for their guns, townsfolk scattering for doorways and behind water troughs and under boardwalks. Bennett's good arm swinging his pistol up from the saddle with the grim one-handed competence of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment through 3 years of not having enough. Garrett working the rifle fast, dropping the angle to the men who were the most immediate danger, buying the open ground around May, the only way open ground in a gunfight can be bought, and May Foster standing still in the middle of the street. On the ground her father had loved, with Roy Maddox's blood in the dirt and Silas Maddox's riders reaching for weapons and a whole town watching from its doorways, she stood still, and she was not still from fear or from freezing or from any failure of nerve. She was still the way a cornerstone is still, the way the rock her father had spent 20 years reading is still, because some things are load-bearing and know it, and do not move. A Maddox man came around the corner of the store at a run with a rifle and a clear angle on Garrett's exposed back, and May raised the shotgun and fired, and the man went down before he completed his third step. She had saved Garrett's life. She did it without drama and without looking at him after, because there was no time for drama, and because she had long since stopped doing the things she did, in hopes that someone would notice the doing. The blacksmith came out of his shop with a long gun, then the storekeeper's son with a smaller one, then an old man from the far end of the street with a pistol he had carried since a war 20 years gone and never expected to use again, then another and another, Silver Creek pouring itself out of its own doorways and into its own street, to stand in a place it had failed to stand 3 years ago, doing the thing now that it had not done then, imperfectly and late and entirely for real. Silas Maddox watched his riders go down, 1 and then 2 and then 3, and watched the town that was supposed to belong to him turn itself against him in the space of 4 minutes, and the smooth face finally completely came apart. He spurred the gray horse straight at May Foster. He came with the knife out because the pistol was empty, straight down the center of the street, at the one piece on the board that mattered, the notebook against her heart. And Garrett was 20 feet away with the spent rifle and a Colt he was already reaching for, and the distance was wrong, the angle was wrong, the arithmetic was wrong in every direction. May Foster did not run. She stood her ground on the street her father had loved, all of her, every pound the world had spent her whole life, telling her to be ashamed of, planted in the dirt like the cornerstone of thing that had been standing longer than any of the people trying to knock it down. And when the gray horse and the knife came down on her, she swung the empty shotgun in a short, hard arc that caught the horse across the muzzle with the full weight of her behind it, and the horse screamed and shied hard left, and Silas Maddox went out of the saddle and hit the dirt of Silver Creek's main street with the heavy, graceless impact of a man who has never once in his life considered the possibility of falling. The knife spun away into the dust. May was on him before he had fully registered the ground. All her weight, all her strength, 3 years of hauled water and patched roofs and stacked stones, and the long grinding labor of a woman keeping herself alive on her own in a kept house, brought down at once onto the chest of the man who had ordered her father's murder, and she had his coat in her 2 fists and her knee in his ribs and her face an inch from his and the whole street watching. My father's name, she said it at a volume the whole street could hear without her raising her voice, which was the most frightening kind of volume there is, was Henry Foster. You say it, in front of all of them, in front of every person in this street who watched you take his name from him. You say whose ground you stole, and whose daughter you tried to put in a ditch, and you say whose mine you have been working on blood money for 3 years. Say his name. Silas Maddox lay in the dirt of a street he had believed he owned, and looked up at the woman he had spent 3 years hunting, and found nothing left in his face that resembled the smooth, patient certainty it had worn an hour ago. There was only a man in the dirt with no more room to manage anything. Henry Foster. He said, "Duh. Henry Foster." The voice cracked on it. Henry Foster's claim. We killed him for it. Roy and I both. We killed him for the mine. He was weeping now, the way cornered men weep, with no dignity and no audience management, and nothing left to protect. God, help me. We killed him and put him in the ground and called it an accident, and we have been working his mine for 3 years. God help me. The street heard it. Every soul in Silver Creek heard Silas Maddox confess to the murder of Henry Foster in the dirt of the main street, in the full morning light, with the whole town standing witness, and not one person who was there that morning would ever in their remaining years be able to say they had not heard it, or had not understood what they were hearing. Bennett's deputies arrived 20 minutes later, 4 hard men on lathered horses who had ridden from Sweetwater on the strength of a folded note carried by a boy on a fast pony, and they found a town already holding its own prisoners. They took Silas Maddox in irons. They took Roy, pale and bandaged and silent. They took the 3 surviving Maddox riders, who had not managed to get their horses turned around in time, and Bennett. sitting his horse with one arm in a sling improvised from May's kerchief, read the charges into the open air of the street with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting 3 years to say a specific set of words out loud. Murder in the first degree, fraud upon the territorial land office, corruption of a sitting judge, bribery of a capital official, conspiracy to commit murder, and at the end of the list, in a voice that had gone quiet and deliberate and final, the theft of the estate and legacy of Henry Foster, prospector of Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, from his lawful heir, Maybelle Foster. His daughter. The wagon that took the Maddox brothers away rolled out of Silver Creek's main street in the early afternoon, and May Foster stood in the street and watched it go, and the town stood around her and watched it with her, and nobody said anything for a long while, because sometimes the right response to the end of a long wrong thing is simply to stand there and let the ending be real before you try to put words on it. Mrs. Hopkins came across the street when the wagon had gone around the bend and the dust had settled back into the dirt, and the crowd had begun to thin at its edges, the people of Silver Creek moving back toward their lives with the particular quietness of people who have something new and heavy to carry in them. She came with flour still on her apron from the morning's interrupted work, and her hands clasped in front of her, the way hands clasp when they have nothing useful left to do, and she stopped a few feet from May, with the look of a woman who has been rehearsing something for a long time, and has arrived at the moment of saying it, and found that all the rehearsal was not enough. Maybelle. Her voice came out cracked at the edges. I have no right to ask anything of you. I know that. I am not here to ask. I am here because I have spent 3 years telling myself that I believed what those men said about your father. And standing here this morning and hearing what I heard, I understand that the believing was a choice I made because it was easier than the other choice. And I am going to carry that the rest of my life. She twisted the apron in her hands. I turned away from you in my own store. You came to buy bread and I turned my face away from you like you were not there. You were 21 years old and you had just buried your father, and I turned my face away. Her voice broke on it cleanly. I am so sorry, child. I am so deeply sorry. May looked at her for a long moment. Garrett watched her look, watched the thing move behind her eyes, the weighing of it, the full and honest accounting of what this woman had done and what it had cost, and what, if anything, was owed in return. I am not the one who can forgive you, Mrs. Hopkins. She said it, without cruelty and without comfort, the plain truth of it set down between them on the dirt. My father is in the ground, and the forgiveness is his to give, and he cannot give it. And that is something you will have to carry, the same way I will carry the 3 years, and the same way Garrett carries his 40 miles, and the same way Pete Hardin carried his one bad night. We all of us have something to carry. She paused. What I can tell you is that I am not going to spend whatever comes next feeding a hatred. I have watched what hatred builds. I watched it build a mine on blood money and a fine house with glass windows, and a man who could not stop writing down his own crimes because he needed someone to know how clever he was. That is what hatred builds when it has enough money and enough time. She looked past Mrs. Hopkins to the street, to the church, to the whole plain ordinary face of the town her father had loved. I intend to build something different. Pike the minister had come down the rest of the church steps during this, and was standing at the edge of it, and when May finished he said nothing. But he took his hat off and held it against his chest, and that was enough. May turned her horse away from the crowd, and rode to the edge of the street where Garrett was standing with the horses, and she swung down and stood beside him, and the two of them watched the last of the Maddox riders disappear around the southern bend in the road. The mine, she said, after a while. My father's mine and the gold beneath it. It is mine now, legal. The moment a court confirms what is in that notebook and what Silas said in this street this morning, with the whole town to witness it. She was quiet, working something through. I am going to work it the way he would have worked it. Honest wages, safe shafts, every man who goes down knowing the timbers were checked before he got on the ladder. And 1 part in 3 of what it brings up to this town. A school with a real teacher, a doctor, the church roof that has been leaking since before I was born. She looked at him, not because they deserve it. They stood on their porches and watched. But I am Henry Foster's daughter, and this is what Henry Foster would have done, and I am not going to be smaller than my father in the one moment that asks me to be as large as he was. Garrett looked at her, at the woman who had just pinned a murderer to the dirt of a public street, and made him confess in front of his own victim's town, and who was now standing at the edge of that street, talking about school roofs and doctors' wages. And he thought that Henry Foster, sitting on a powder keg in an east-facing drift with the discovery of a lifetime in the rock around him, had been thinking of exactly this. Not the gold, this. He went down on one knee in the dirt of the South Road. He did not have a speech. He had never been a speech kind of man, and this was not a moment that wanted one. He had in his vest pocket a thin gold band that had been his mother's, worn smooth on the inner face from the years she had worn it, and the years after that, when he had carried it because he could not make himself put it down and could not make himself give it to anyone else. He had carried it through the campaigns and through the carpentry years and through every lonely winter in between. Not as a talisman exactly, but as a reminder of what he understood a promise made in good faith to look like. He held it up. Mabel Foster. His voice came out of him rough and plain, and without decoration, which was the only kind of voice he had. I rode into your life with $1 and a saddlebag full of things I did not know how to put down. You are the first person since I stood in front of 2 small graves who looked at all of me, the 40 miles and the empty years, and the place where a heart is supposed to be, and saw something that might be worth standing next to, instead of walking past. He looked up at her. I have a pair of hands that know how to build a thing that lasts, and I have a piece of ground with gold running under it, and I have whatever is left of a life that has been waiting a long time to be lived in the present tense. I would like to spend what is left of it building something with you. A house, a life, something that goes on past the 2 of us into the ground of this valley and stays. He turned the ring once in his fingers. Marry me. Let me build you a house with glass windows you can throw wide every morning of the world. Let me be there. That is the whole offer. It is not much dressed up, but it has my whole heart inside it, and I mean every word of it until I am in the ground. May Foster looked down at the kneeling man and the worn gold ring catching the afternoon light, and her broad face did the complicated thing it did when she was feeling more than one true thing at once. Men have looked at me my whole life and seen too much of something, she said. Too much to accommodate. Too much to be comfortable around. I spent 24 years making myself smaller on the inside to balance what the world said was too much on the outside. Her voice was steady and her eyes were bright. And then a man I had never seen walked through my door and spent 2 days looking at me like there was exactly the right amount of me. Not a problem to be solved or a thing to be managed, but a person, the whole entire person, exactly as she came. She reached down and took his hand with the ring in it, in both of hers. Yes, Garrett Dalton. 1,000 times yes. Build me the house, throw the curtains wide. I have been standing behind the half-drawn curtain for 3 years, and I am done with it. I am done with every version of making myself less to fit through doors that were built too narrow on purpose. He stood and put the ring on her finger. It would not go past the knuckle. Her broad, strong finger was twice the size his mother's had been, and the ring stopped halfway and sat there, and they both looked at it, and then they began to laugh. The first clean, unguarded laughter either of them had managed in longer than they could separately account for, standing in the dirt of the South Road at the end of the hardest week of their lives. I will have it made to fit, he said. Every bit of you. Exactly as you are, you had better. She pulled him in by the front of his coat and kissed him, there on the South Road in the afternoon light, with the church behind them, and the town of Silver Creek all around them, and the gold hills of her father's legacy rising above the whole of it. She kissed him without 1 inch of herself held back, or tucked away, or offered at half measure, and the town of Silver Creek, which had spent 3 years trying to forget that Mabel Foster existed, saw every bit of it, and would remember it a great deal longer than it had remembered the forgetting. The wedding came 7 weeks later, in the Silver Creek church that Pike had been tending for 20 years, with a leaking roof and a stubborn faith, and the whole town came. Not from obligation and not from guilt exactly, though both of those things were present in the room, but in the way that people come to a thing when they understand, it is both a celebration and a reckoning, and they owe attendance at both. Mrs. Hopkins made the dress. She came to May 3 days after the street and asked if she might, and May said yes, and Mrs. Hopkins spent 2 weeks on it, letting it out and letting it out again with the careful attention of a woman doing penance through her best skill, and she never once made a face about the measurements or the fabric or the letting out. She simply made the dress that fit the woman who was going to wear it. And the dress was beautiful, which was the only true thing about it that needed saying. Bennett walked May down the aisle in the place of the father who could not. His arm was in a proper sling now, the shoulder beginning the long work of healing, and he walked straight and slow with the deliberateness of a man who understands the weight of the thing he is being asked to carry, and is glad to carry it. When he put her hand in Garrett's at the foot of the altar, his face did the thing the faces of men do. When they are feeling something they have decided they are allowed to feel. Garrett stood at the altar in a clean, dark coat and watched May come down the aisle toward him and did not look at anything else in the room. He had looked at a great many things in his life. He had looked at 2 small graves, and at 100 miles of empty campaign country, and at the inside of a great many lonely rented rooms. He knew the difference between looking at a thing and seeing it, and what he saw coming down that aisle toward him was a woman who had been thrown away by the world, and had refused the throwing, who had survived 3 years of wolves, and the death of everyone who loved her, and had come out the far side of it not reduced but clarified, knowing exactly what she was and what she was for. And he understood that he was the luckiest man in Wyoming Territory, and possibly the continent. When Pike said the words and they said theirs back, the whole church erupted, not in the polite, appreciative applause of a ceremony done correctly, but in the sound of people who needed the release of it, who had been carrying the weight of what they had allowed and what it had cost, and who were grateful, in the uncomplicated way that people are sometimes grateful, to have something to cheer for instead. Pet Hardin was not there. Boone Carter was not there. Henry Foster was not there. But they were all 3 in the room, in the way that the dead are in rooms when the living carry them in with enough love. And Garrett felt them the way he had felt Sarah and Lily in the kept house 2 weeks ago. Close and present and approving of the proceedings. The grave they made for Pete in the spring, proper with a stone, was on the hillside above the ranch with a view of the east drift where he had seen what he had seen and come back at last to say it. Boone Carter's grave was beside Henry Foster's, which was where it should have been, the 2 old friends together on the hillside they had both believed in. May said words over each of them, the same plain, honest words she brought to everything, and Garrett stood beside her for each one. 9 months after the wedding, which was in the spring of 1884, and came in like every Wyoming spring, cold and then suddenly and almost violently green, the house was done. Garrett had built it through the winter, working every hour of light and some hours that were not quite light, and it was not a large house, but it was a true one. Every joint fitted tight, every board laid straight, the roof built to carry the weight of 20 Wyoming winters without complaint, and it had glass windows. Wide ones, 4 of them, 1 on each wall of the main room, more glass than any sensible person put in a frontier house, more glass than the Glazier and Sweetwater had ever been asked to supply to a single customer, the whole bright valley pouring in from every direction. May stood in the middle of the main room, on the morning they moved in, and turned slowly, looking out through each window in turn. The hills to the north where her father's mine was running honest and full, the town to the south where a new school was half built, and a doctor had taken up residence in the house the town had built him. The ranch yard to the east where the horses stood in the morning light. And to the west, nothing but the open country running away to the horizon, the long grass and the rock and the enormous Wyoming sky that had no interest in anyone's opinion of it, and was beautiful anyway. She stood in the center of all 4 of those windows, and she did not pull a single curtain. Well, she said. Garrett came and stood behind her, and put his hands on the great round of her belly, which was very round now, 7 months along and growing daily with the particular purposeful roundness of the thing inside it, and he felt the small, fierce drumming of his child against his palms. Strong, he said. She does not stop. May put her hands over his. Not for an hour. Your daughter is going to be absolutely exhausting, Garrett. I want you to know that now, so you cannot claim you were not warned. My daughter. Your daughter. She has your stubbornness already. I can feel it. She has decided she wants more room, and she has been taking it all week without asking anyone's permission. Garrett pressed his lips to the warm curve of May's neck and felt her lean back against him, all of her, and looked out through the west window at the country running away to the horizon. He thought about $1. About what $1 bought on a morning in late summer, when a man was tired of running from his own life, and an old frightened man behind a land office desk was running out of time to keep a promise. He thought about a cracked door and a chimney with smoke rising from it, and a woman coming down a staircase with steady eyes and no apology in her. He thought about what Henry Foster had written in the margins of a mining journal, that every foot of those hills he had been walking towards something that was always going to be his daughter's. That he had thought of her face before he thought of any price. Outside, the spring light moved across the hills, where the silver ran and the gold ran deeper, and the school, going up in Silver Creek, caught the morning on its new lumber, and the graves on the hillside above the ranch held the people who had paid the price of this particular morning, in the particular currency that morning had required of them. Inside, in a house with glass windows thrown wide to the world, a woman who had been thrown away and had refused the throwing stood in the light, with her husband's hands on the child they were building together. And she was not behind any curtain, and she was not making herself small, and she was not surviving. She was living, the whole enormous, unashamed, unreduced, full-sized fact of her living.